And we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is an impromptu live chat between myself and my special guest here, Joshua City, aka 86BOXING. Josh, what's up, brother?
Hey, man. Happy to be here. It's good talking with you.
Yeah, it's great having you. Shout out to Andre. Shout out to Scrapbook. Shout out to Hardline Boxing, aka the Boxing Librarian, and all the other regulars. Rodolfo, all the guys always come in and show the love. Nick, Bruce, everybody. And thanks to anyone else listening, live or after the fact. We're just going to have a little talk about the great Harry Greb. Nothing too heavy. We don't have too many stats or anything loaded, just a few graphics. But we were talking on the phone, felt like doing this. Just some people get some benefit out of just hearing us celebrate the greats. So, Josh, of all the great things about Greb, is there any one thing that stands out to you the most, would you say?
Yeah, interestingly enough, man, there's so many things. I would say it's between two things. Of course, one of them is that 1919 year in which he went 45-0. That's 45 wins with 0 losses. Then the other thing is just his resume in general, in which I view as probably the top resume in boxing history, just the amount of people he ended up fighting. Just to think about that and take into account the way it was during those times, the conditions these fighters had to go through. And not only that, Greb, he didn't have a ton of knockouts if you look at the amount of fights he had. So that shows that he had to do it, the hard way. He had to go to distance oftentimes. And taking that into account and looking at his resume, that's arguably the greatest resume the sport has seen. So it would certainly be that, and then that 1919 year, which ironically enough, working on a video right now, hopefully have that posted here shortly. And thankfully I get to collaborate with yourself, of course, just sort of breaking news, I guess you can say that. So I'm looking forward to that. And it's going to be touching on that 1919 year in a certain capacity. Of course, we're not going to dive into the full fights, but definitely recognizing it for the great year that it was. So those are the standout things for me, just thinking about it off top.
Yeah, I hear you there. The schedule, and just for the uninitiated, this was his busiest, most winningest year. But it wasn't like he did this and everything else was like marginal. Like the year before, he didn't go undefeated, but he had a tremendous amount of fights, and his win-loss percentage was ridiculous. And the year before that was even crazier. So his run leading up to that 1919, there's 1916. Look at the schedule he's keeping. And you can just keep going back with him. He never...
Insane.
Even his debut year, I think he might have had some amateur work the same year, but as far as pro fights, it was a slow year for him. He had 9 fights as a professional. It was pretty crazy. So that's the thing that stands out to me the most. But there's so many boxes that this great fighter checked off. Like you said, stopping power might not have been his main thing. I mean, he could punch, but like he stayed light on his feet, and also he damaged his hands just with so many shots. He was from unorthodox angles he was hitting people with, so he couldn't always crack that one punch knockout power, but throughout the entirety of his career. But every other box he really checks in an intense way. And like you said, the strength of competition, like, my goodness, just legend after legend. Like, his Hall of Fame resume is larger than some Hall of Famers' total fight career.
Indeed.
Like, that's the kind of, if you get up anywhere near a half century of fights against Hall of Famers, you're in rarefied air, even amongst the greats. Like, most people just never have an opportunity. But Harry Greb was totally crazy. He was out of his mind. He was totally driven to succeed and to compete. So he wanted to fight everyone. So part of this schedule, for those listeners that don't know, so part of the reason his schedule could be like this is because he would go fight someone, in one city. He'd have a big fight, and then he'd go try to fight a bunch of other guys in that same city while he was there. Like a rock band doing multiple venues in one city on a tour. So he just kept piling it on. It's pretty out of this world. But he also, other boxes he checks, like even when he was past his prime, he was still superbly dangerous. I mean, you know this, Josh, from working on these historical fighters videos. A lot of times when they get to the end, they stop being competitive at the highest levels. That's even true of some of the all-time greats like Sam Langford, maybe Muhammad Ali, fighters that are just immeasurably great, but they, at the very end, it's tough for them. Greb's not really like that. He was a beast all the way up till his early death, really, you know. And
Yeah,
is that something you noticed, having done work on so many of these great fighters for your video series, which everyone should go check out, by the way, 86 Boxing.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, you know, that is one of one of those things that it becomes a little bit apparent, and I guess glaring in some sense. You kind of see where the tide essentially shifts, and some of these fighters, these great fighters who you're accustomed to seeing winning just over and over at a high level, you can see where it starts to shift a bit, and you start to see maybe a few more losses, if not even if it's a situation where it's not a ton of losses or anything. You just kind of look at who they lost to, and you try to factor in like that stage of their career. You know, you start to lose some of that speed, some of those reflexes, and of course, it's something that everyone has to go through. Greb, of course, he was fighting at a high level to the very end of his career, essentially. But even with him having slowed down a bit, he was still better than a lot of the boxers that were out there on a world scale, just based on the time. So he continued to compete, and yeah, he went through one of those things that, of course, all of us go through in terms of if you're competing in any sport, and Father Time comes knocking at the door. But he had the ability to make the adjustments that were needed. That's something I know that I've read and I've even heard through some videos and things of that nature, say from Boxing Librarian, yourself, Scrapbook, others, in terms of how Greb, he really had to shift the way he fought as he got older. And I'm doing air quotes here because realistically, you know, he died at 32 years of age, and that's a young age. But in the boxing world at that particular time, uh, you could consider that an old age. But essentially, once he started to lose a step or two, and of course his eye being one of those major things, he had to adjust things, and he had to fight a little bit more on the inside to make sure that he was there, able to at least have that feel or see in whatever with whatever sort of level of vision that he had to make sure that he could actually continue to compete. And I think that's pretty telling that even during those times, he was still a force to be reckoned with, and he was still someone who you're some of the top level fighters they just wouldn't want to get in the ring with. Similar thing with Sam Langford. And I know we've had some discussions on him as well as to where later on in his career, even when he was practically blind and not in the shape that he previously had been, some fighters still didn't want to deal with him because they knew it was a challenge. So Greb, guys like Langford, there's some others as well, but that's like rarefied territory there. I mean, you don't see that type of stuff today, and we have some advancements in things here these days from a nutritional standpoint, and that's something that's always brought up. But just thinking about how these individuals were able to do this back then, I mean, that's true gladiator style, warrior type stuff. That's the type of mentality you had to have, and that's why I have great respect for these fighters of the past and commend them for the work they put in.
Yeah, well put, sir. Hey, shout out Rodolfo. What's up, man?
Rodolfo, shout out Rodolfo. Appreciate you, man. Appreciate you for sure.
Yeah, it's great. And for anyone, for listeners after the fact or newer listeners, a lot of us, we've all congregated in the past in like the live chat section for the Boxing Librarians videos. That's Hardline Boxing Talk. Go check that channel out. You want to see some historical content. We both strongly recommend Hardline Boxing Talk and Scrapbook Boxing. These are channels you can't go wrong. Whatever kind of fighter you're a fan of, especially like seeing the bigger picture, as well as like the in-depth texture, is quite a pleasant blend of the two. And I would also recommend Josh's channel here, 86BOXING. Just a vibrant, fresh, and fun look at some of the greatest fighters of all time, especially of the old school. He also has an excellent podcast. Give a shout out to your own podcast real quick, Josh.
Hey, appreciate it. Yeah, 86 Boxing Podcast. You know, we try to come in there on Sundays for our program, and we try to do that probably around the 1 o'clock time frame, somewhere in there. But yeah, it's 86 Boxing Podcast. You can check it out on all the platforms, all that good stuff. You know, we just get in there and talk a little boxing. We talk more modern stuff, but occasionally we'll throw in some of the historic stuff. As a matter of fact, been thinking a lot as of late of trying to do it another day in order to get more of this historic boxing talk jumping off. So, but I appreciate it. 86 Boxing Podcast, baby.
Yeah, Rodolfo just said I hit 200 subs. I didn't realize I had. So thanks to everyone who's a repeat listener, and thanks to everyone who just listens once and is like, this guy's crazy and never comes back. Thank you anyway. You know, it's just good that people are celebrating these old fighters, because we can't trust the promotions to do it. They have businesses to run. It's not in their business to be like, you know, nobody today has done what Harry Greb did. Now pay for our fights. It just doesn't work. So we have to celebrate guys like Greb, Langford, and even boxers like Ali, who are widely celebrated. The fans, the hardcore fans, and the more independent media, like, they do a lot to keep the memory alive. So
no doubt about it. No doubt about that. And if I can interject, I just want to say, yeah, shout out to you, Random, all the other ones, just kind of to harken on that. People out here doing what is really, you know, a lot of work just to dig up this history on these different fighters and put these videos together, things of that nature. Like, shout out to everyone out there doing that. And if you really look at it, it's a small segment, but the reach in itself in terms of the audience, we've been able to get a lot of these historic boxes in front of, you know, that's priceless in some sense. So yeah, that's a big thing. So yeah, definitely continue to do what you do. And yeah, we have to keep these fighters' legacies alive. You know, we get too caught in the moment these days with some things, but these were great fighters for their time. They didn't have the advantage of some of the technological stuff that we have now. So I think it's a part of the duty in some sense for us to continue to show the greatness of these fighters.
yeah, absolutely, brother. I agree. And a lot of the people who are passionate about this era are very passionate about it. So they, you know, anyone who appreciates this kind of content, good for y'all. And just, you know, feel free to comment after the fact in the comments, or join one of the live chats, or find one of us on social media and feel free to interact. You know, we've got to keep the memory alive of some of these great achievements in sports, especially when boxing was a very, very important sport. It's not like today. I don't know if there is a single sport that has that potency relative to all of sports that boxing had, especially in the U.S. at that time. At this time right here, this was the big time. But like you were saying about Greb having to adapt his style as he got older. So like this is his 1925 season. He lost a single fight to the great Gene Tunney, who was much larger than him, especially at this point. They had a series of fights, but by now Tunney was like a full-size heavyweight. And Greb was still fighting. He was still able to make middleweight. He actually beat the great Mickey Walker, who moved up from welterweight to try and take that title. And they had a phenomenal fight. It was filmed. It's not in the public eye. Whether or not it survived, I'm not sure, but there's no film of that fight, but it was filmed. But that was apparently one of the great battles.
Yeah.
So, you know, but he was long past his prime. He had damage in one eye, so he was basically a cyclops. And he fought this schedule this far past his prime. This was several years after he got damage in one eye. So he was able to do this. And then his very last year, he went out on a loss, but he lost 2 decisions to the great Tiger Flowers. And there's no shame in that. He lost to another all-time great when he was half blind, but he wasn't the only one who suffered great adversity in his career, though, and did great things. I mean, this was something in this era. There were a lot of really hard men who were seriously driven, like abnormally driven. You see that in later generations, like great Rocky Marciano. He was abnormally driven, but he fought more of a modern style schedule. Lots of training and then excellent performances in his fights. But he wasn't. Greb was kind of piling on a tour of fights, an endless tour from 13 to 26, and then he died. He basically just fought himself to death. I guess it was an operation for scar tissue, and he had a bad reaction to the anesthesia. So he basically did fight himself to death. So he didn't get to live out like the glory or become a great trainer or this great personality, a commentator, a pundit. But so we have to celebrate what he did get to do, which is put together probably the craziest resume this side of Sam Langford. And it's close. It really is. But those two guys, they stand above. They just did so much, you can't hardly sum it up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, yeah, when you really break it down, it's amazing. Yeah, you'd be hard pressed finding any other fighters with a resume as deep as these two. There are some out there who can definitely rival in some sense, but yeah, when you talk Greb, Langford, I mean, you're talking the upper echelon as far as resume is concerned, and just being able to compete at the highest level. I mean, these guys have been in with almost any and everyone who would actually step in with them. Of course, you can only control what you can control, but I think they left a mark on the sport, and that's why. And I think we were talking about this earlier. I mean, everyone has an opinion and all of that stuff, but when you really boil it down, there's a reason these guys' names have stood the test of time. There's a reason we're still talking about Harry Greb and Sam Langford. There have been many boxers, many thousands of boxers, maybe even more than that, many hundreds of thousands, many millions, who knows, in all actuality. But those names that stand out, those were the greats of the time. And you better believe that if they were in this era right now, they would be just as dominant, if not more. So shout out to those guys. Shout out to the Real Ranger Danger, too, if I could, real quick. That's what I'm
Bruce,
talking about. Appreciate him.
Real Ranger
Bruce
Danger.
Gas.
What's up, man? Also, Bruce, thanks for stopping by, sir.
Shout out Bruce Gas. I got hit to Bruce through your channel, Random. I rock with him for sure.
Yeah, it's nice to just hear people talk about the great battles. And there's plenty of different generations, that, including this current one, where there's some great battles. Like if you had to talk to someone from a few decades ago, you could pick out a good 5 or 10 fights from this era that were just absolutely stellar. It would be hard to narrow it down that just to 10 fights, but you wouldn't be wanting, I mean, there's a lot. Combat sports are alive and well in the modern era. MMA and boxing both, and kickboxing is doing pretty good too. Professional grappling is actually doing really well, so it's just a great time for fight fans.
Yeah, definitely. We have more avenues than ever. That's one of the things I am fond of. There were questions as far as this shift to the streaming services, because this was something new. Of course, it's like a regular thing for us now, but I always view that as a positive, not only just from the standpoint of you being able to get the new stuff, the more modern fights in terms of the things going on now, but even with some of the archives that some of these promotions have released. So I'm all for it. More avenues, more fighters that we get the chance to see. And I think it'll continue to grow. We'll continue to see more things that are more of these brands or what have it that are providing excellent content just in general surrounding the sport. Or just combat sports as a whole, and I think when you have that type of parity, when you have a lot of these different avenues out there, I think that can only be just good for the sport. More chances to get more eyes on it, more chances to keep things live and keep people interested. So, and as long as the best are fighting the best, that is, of course, the ultimate goal. then the sport in itself will continue to thrive. So that's what I'm aiming for, just continuing to stay on this journey,
Yeah, man. It's been nice to, as a casual fan of today's scene, it's been nice to just hear about the unifications and Canelo weight jumping, champ versus champ fights, but just people trying to unify lineages in spite of all these myriad belts that are not I mean, they're not unique to boxing. MMA has a ton of belts. Every promotion has its own set of belts because it runs like leagues. So think how that would be. All the different matchroom belts, all the different top rank belts, all the different PBC belts. That's what MMA is, the different promotions. So it's no better. There's tons of belts. The good thing about boxing is when the money is right, they can unify. They're not closed off in a league. I love that. So some of these big fights that are coming up, I'm all for it. I love it. My favorite modern era boxing match, the one that I love to watch the most, Joe Calzaghe, School and Jeff Lacey, two undefeated champions unifying unifying basically the pyramids, how sharp is the top of the pyramid. Greb was avoided for so very long. To like this year, he didn't get a world title shot after this year, even though he fought Baton Levinsky light heavyweight champ, but he didn't get a title shot.
Wow.
How crazy is that? That's a Hall of Fame career, all compressed into 1 year. If a boxer did that in their career, they'd be a Hall of Famer. They went 45-0 with all those Hall of Fame wins.
That is,
he did it in 1 year, but he didn't get a shot.
That year is basically the modern boxer, probably with less Hall of Famers on the resume at that, but that is essentially the modern boxer, just putting that into perspective,
Right. And it's not even to minimize the modern boxers. The structure is different. The promotional cycle, the commissions that have mandated rest periods between fights for their own safety, the Muhammad Ali Act, which gives them enough rights and leverage to get better money for their efforts. So there's a reason today's boxing is structured the way it is. Lots of guys are making lots of money. That draws people into the sport. So things are beautifully structured for the athletes to get theirs. All the horror stories of people dying young or having inadvisable experiences that end in their own doom. All the cautionary tales of boxing history. Right now, it's never been as good as it is right now for boxers. So I try to remember that. But that's not measuring fight greatness, which is not based on how fair it was. It's just based on what was done.
Yeah.
And Harry Greb, whether or not it's a good idea to fit 300 fights in so few years against that level of competition and be that driven, fight with a broken hand and fight through all manner of adversity and give up weight to Hall of Famers and even fight, as a guy who could fight at middleweight, he's fighting heavyweight contenders. And it's like, and keeping this kind of win-loss record is just astounding. And it's a great thing to celebrate. But it's not to say the guys today aren't doing something extremely difficult. It's just a different structure now where people prepare for their opponent over a long period of time without using fights to stay sharp. They use training to stay sharp. I don't know which is better, but I do know which one results in more fights. That would be the Harry Greb style. Like some of these easier opponents or maybe lesser, like lower level opponents, but heavier than him, they would serve as sort of real life punching bags because he was so good for his really top opponents, of which he had many, dozens and dozens. So quite a unique, not a unique career in its structure, but he was uniquely successful doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yes, and indeed. And we were talking about this, I know, previously in terms of like thinking about guys and the amount of times they fought, Harry Greb being one of the most active in history and all of that stuff. Just looking at it from a modern standpoint, even as well, I have to shout out and salute guys like Canelo, who even with being at the top of the sport, tries to remain fairly active, by comparison to what the majority of the boxers are doing today. Typically, when guys are first coming into the sport, really trying to make a name, they have a lot of activities, but these are lower level fights. But essentially, Canelo, even at this particular point, he's been very active. You know, he's been moving up and down weights, and I think, hey, challenge yourself. That's what they did back in the day. Oftentimes, we see in this particular era or here in modern times, a lot of the guys are on a trajectory of trying to move down in weight in terms of losing as much as they can to get that advantage in size, because they can use all these different methods to try and drop down in weight. But in Greb's time, you know, they were trying to move up in weight, regardless of whether they could put on the weight or not. You know, they would go in at what they walked around at, or what they typically fought at. You know, so that right there is just a totally different mindset. And you know, the guys of the day, they definitely deserve their credit and all that stuff. And I think we do have some very good, even great fighters that have been competing and everything. It's just different parallels between the times. But these guys back then, they were just built different. There's no other way of saying it. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. They were built different, and they competed differently. And you know that can't be duplicated. I don't think it'll ever be duplicated again. Some of the feats that these guys had back then, I know we were talking about that too. It's just some of these records, just some of the things that they were doing back then. The likes of a Greb, like you probably won't see a record like this, at least in our lifetime, in the world of boxing. I mean, come on, the amount of guys he fought. Even if you saw someone match that level of fights as far as the overall amount, you're just not going to see them in there with the level of competition that the likes of Greb was in with. So that's just worth, you know, thinking about, food for thought right there.
Yeah, it's almost like if you take today's schedule and you sort of visualize it as an accordion, and then you just scrunch that accordion up so that, say, 4 or 5 years of the whole sport all happens in 1 year. That's maybe a rough approximation of what this time. There were some exceptions. Not everyone fought 10 or more fights a year, but lots and lots of guys fought 10 or more fights a year. So and that wasn't 10 wasn't high. It was just 10 is a number that a lot of people reached in many years of their careers. It was just how the sport was structured. Live gates, not film rights. What are they worth at that point for all but the select few? They're worth nothing. You're just going in to make purses and side bets and things like that. So, you know, with the no decision, so with the newspaper decisions, of which the no decision states, which included Pennsylvania. So Greb, you know, in Pittsburgh, where he was an idol, in the whole Midwest, but especially Pittsburgh, he, you know, a lot of the bouts were limited in length, and if no one got finished, then there was no official decision. So what would happen is the newspaperman would score it. And so however many men were on the scene, that's your judging pool as far as the way we see it now. So some newspaper decisions are completely one-sided. Some of them are actually what I guess you could say split newspaper decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Or a variation of it, like when Sam Langford, the second fight he had with fireman Jim Flynn, which happened in 1910. He'd already smacked him around in less than a round in 1908, but in 1910, he fought Flynn a second time in a newspaper decision. And I guess one newspaper went for Langford, one newspaper went for Flynn, and the ref said he would have given it to Flynn if there had been a decision rendered, if I'm remembering. So, but we count that as a loss. We're like, okay, it was 2-1 from the people who were there, who are good judges of boxing, because the press in those days was harsh and brutal. Yeah. Hometown guy or not, they were harsh or brutal. There's some examples of fluffing and bias, but there's so much less than today. It's almost unrecognizable. When you see how somebody describes someone, you'd be like, wow, he just had a hard fight. Like, it's so for someone like Greb to reach this sort of, to be an idol, he really had to do extra. These guys really had to do extra to stand out, because lots of people were doing some intense stuff. Hey, shout out to Haplo. And Haplo said fights is better, clearly. I think you're probably right, Haplo. Fighting to stay sharp for fighting is like you're actually doing the thing. It's like, you know, what's better, like me practicing guitar by just tapping my fingers on the palm of my hand, which is a way to build muscle memory, or playing a guitar. Well, if my fingers aren't too sore, playing guitar is better than tapping, you know, practicing muscle memory. So maybe fighting's like that, something that involves a certain level of coordination with discipline and creativity and broken rhythm and things like that. Doing it in the full is better than simulating it. Let's see. Real range of danger, knowledge you guys have about boxing in the early 1900s, but also 1800s is unbelievable. I learn something every day. I'm in that same boat, brother. I learn things all the time, and it's all starting to fit together in my tiny mind. So, and it's great to talk to people like Joshua City here, and I've got a talk coming up on the 11th with Scrapbook Boxing and the Boxing Librarian. They're going to come on my channel. We're going to try and rank our top 10 lists of the greatest middleweights of all time, and we've set no criteria, so it could be anyone. So we could go with success or how good someone was at their peak at that weight. So there are guys who didn't spend long at middleweight that were phenomenal at that weight. They were legendary at that weight, but they might not have had a lot of fights. There are some guys who were factors at middleweight for over a decade at the highest level. So it'll be interesting to see. There are clean records, with long streaks, like, Hopkins, Hagler, Monzon. Then there are also more mixed records at middleweight, like Ray Robinson. Like, if you actually look at his middleweight thing, there's a reason he was able to win the belt so many times, because he also lost it. But he was fighting at a level of competition that was staggering. It's not like it's a diss on him, but there are different textures for what we would consider success. Greb had a phenomenal all-time great middleweight run with very few losses against men his own size at that weight. But he didn't have a lot of title accomplishments because the middleweights wanted nothing to do with him holding the title because he was that good. So Johnny Wilson did his best not to fight him, and even though he was the champ, and the newspapers were brutal. The newspapers basically, the clippings I've seen, the papers talked about the matchup as though, when is Johnny Wilson going to hurry up so that Harry Greb can smack the crap out of him? Like, it was spoken of as a given because of who Greb had already beaten. He had already beaten, people from middleweight all the way through light heavyweight to heavyweight. Like the first time he fought Gene Tunney, he absolutely thrashed Tunney brutally, and he gave up 12 pounds in that fight. 12 and a quarter pounds to be precise, the afternoon of the fight. So Tunney came in at 174.5. I don't know if he cut weight to make that, so maybe he was even a little heavier by fight time. But the first time they fought, Greb absolutely thrashed him, brutalized him. So Tunney went on to not lose again for the rest of his career. He was unbeaten when they met. Then Tunney didn't, and they fought a draw. I mean, they fought I think Tunney got the next one, but it was considered a robbery. Like, Greb should have gotten it by the press who were there. But then as the rivalry went on, Tunney got better and better and bigger. And so in the last fight, he dominated. But Greb gave Gene Tunney his only loss, and he was a little dude. So, it's no curiosity why Johnny Wilson, a man Greb's own size, wouldn't necessarily want to put his title up against this guy who could thrash legitimate world-class light heavyweights and heavyweights, like the greats of his generation, where he could get the best of, like, Jeff Smith and Tommy Loughran and Tommy Gibbons and, like, these great fighters. Just, it's ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it is crazy. It's just amazing stuff. I was thinking about that Greb and Tunney. Now I'm trying to recall. It was either the second or third fight, but maybe it was the second. I know there was another fight in there that I was reading some of the papers, and it seemed like a lot of them were leaning heavily towards Greb having won that fight, even though Tunney ended up getting the decision. But I just can't remember which fight it was. I don't know if it was the second, third. I don't know if you recall.
That was the rematch. I think that was the rematch in their second fight. But then I'm trying to remember the result. I think it was like, I can't remember if the second match was a draw or if it was a Tunney win and the third one was a draw, but it was more competitive. The first fight and the last fight were uncompetitive, going either direction. The other three fights were competitive in their own ways. And actually, even in that first fight, even though apparently Greb broke Tunney's nose in the first round and he just sliced him to ribbons, but in the last three rounds, Tunney made a valiant, attempt at a comeback in the fight. He did rally in the 2 of the last 3 rounds, and then the very last round he had some moments. So it wasn't like, even when it was, but I think their last fight was pretty much uncompetitive. Tunney was too big and Greb was too far gone from his prime, because we're talking about someone who's trying to give up size to a legend. It's different when you give up size to a legend than just giving up size to a contender or something, so these all-time great clashes, it's tough. But, Greb had enough in the tank in, hold on, let me pull up the slide. Yeah, so that last Tunney fight in 25, he still had enough in the tank to win all of those other fights, and he was fighting with one eye, and he wasn't as mobile. He didn't have quite the same stamina, and so he was more clinch work, more up close. He couldn't dart in and out. He didn't have a sense of range because he was a Cyclops, So, but he still beat the great Mickey Walker that year, and beat Maxie Rosenblum, and Rosenblum, he beat him so well that Rosenblum took the influence. He said he was, because he was young at the time, I think he was 19 at the time of the fight, and he went in with Greb, and his people thought he was ready. He was not ready, but he learned so much, and he patterned his style in some ways after Greb. And to relate that to more modern times, Customato said Rosenblum might have been the cleverest fighter he ever saw. Cuss was around for some of these guys, and then Cuss, obviously, sure. Right, Cuss, the genius behind perfecting the peekaboo, with like Patterson and Tyson both being the prime examples of how that could work. Patterson was a small guy to move up and become heavyweight champ, so a larger, if Patterson were 20 pounds larger, who knows what he would have done, because he had just remarkable hand speed, reflexes, and he was a great fighter, but he was just a little undersized. Tyson wasn't huge, but he had a little more concussive power, so the style translated beautifully. But if someone like Cuss, one of these greats, is referencing Rosenblum and his cleverness and how hard he was to hit, well, some of that is thanks to Rosenblum taking a tough fight pretty early in his career against a legend like Greb. But that Walker fight too, that was more competitive, but Walker's one of the greats, and he fought a crazy schedule, and he was able to win in his career above that weight, at middleweight and above, became the champ at middleweight, even became a contender at heavyweight. So, Greb, to be so far past it, this is 25. He's been one-eyed for a few years now. He can still get it done. Just incredible. So other careers like Langford, the end of Langford's career is much more of a mixed record. Even though he kept a winning record, he wasn't winning. He did have one of those. He did have the great win over Tiger Flowers, where he knocked out the great Tiger Flowers. That was epic, and he was mostly blind. But in general, Langford at the very highest levels, he couldn't get past Wills at the end of his career. And to be fair, pretty much no one else could get past Wills either. There's a reason Dempsey didn't want to fight him. To the point that New York State was trying to force Dempsey to fight Wills. And I think he might have even been forbidden from fighting in the state over not having that fight, because Wills, this was the early ratings era, and Wills was the guy. He was the great Brown Panther.
Yeah. That is interesting. Just thinking about that. I know we were discussing it, just thinking about like the heavyweight history and all that stuff. Is one of those things where generally, I guess you can say, starting with Sullivan, if we think about it from MOQ rules, like once you won the heavyweight title, that came with so much as far as the accolades, the opportunities. You got opportunities to get into acting, stage plays, etc. So if you really look back at some of those earlier heavyweight champions, a lot of times once they actually won the title, they had less fights, or they became a little less active than they were leading up to that point. And that seemed to continue to be the case until, I would say, at least around when Joe Louis won the title in some sense. And, he had, of course, all the title defenses and everything. And that's probably why his record will stand the test of time for a long time. But it's interesting thinking about that just in general, how it shifted the dynamic. Being the world heavyweight champion, that means you were probably the most popular guy in America at that time, arguably the world, but you're definitely known on that world stage. To just think about the fact that you have a guy like Greb, who, while he was a middleweight, is widely known that he could compete at that level, that heavyweight level. And realistically, if he'd have gotten an opportunity at Jack Dempsey, just think about how the potential is that history could have kind of shifted, even in some sense. Just thinking about that, so many intriguing things. You can go down a rabbit hole just thinking about stuff of that nature. But picture Greb as the world heavyweight champion. I mean, that's crazy to think about, but it was definitely a possibility.
It really was. Like, he was matched with Gumbo Smith. I think it was 1920 as for an eliminator to fight Dempsey. And 5 years later, I found in the paper, Dempsey's in it with the New York Commission over the Wills fight. But the headline was hilarious. Dempsey temporarily refuses Greb fight. This is 5 years after Greb thrashed Gumbo Smith in a fight that was supposedly for a title shot. But Greb, Greb was busy. He was an exaggerated version of the times, which was contenders had to do way more than the champions. But then there were exceptions. There were champions that they may not have had a ton of title fights in a year, maybe only 2 or 3, but they fought a schedule around that, often at a higher weight than they belonged in. And that's one of the things. So like with Langford here, yeah, he didn't get a shot against Jack Johnson, but he was fighting all kinds of great fighters and also just badasses and tough guys across several weights simultaneously. He wasn't fighting marginal competition and being shut out from Jack Johnson's world title shot. Like you mentioned, Johnson was less active. Johnson's schedule leading up to his title shot against Tommy Burns was fantastic. He had a great career. If he never fought Tommy Burns, he had a great career, but he fought Tommy Burns in 1908. And from that point on, I don't want to disparage the competition, but he was fighting the kinds of guys who would lose to the top contenders and who weren't doing the work at heavyweight. So his former rivals like Langford there, second from the left, McVeigh and Jeanette, they were fighting a champion style schedule. Johnson was taking somewhat easier fights or guys who were smaller or older. And then when he lost to Willard was, I don't want to be harsh, but he was practically useless as a world champ in terms of wanting to see someone be active. Like Tommy Burns made lots of defenses against mixed levels of competition. Johnson going back before, okay, so Hart made no defenses and lost it to Burns immediately. So he fought for the vacant belt. So Jeffries retired undefeated. Hart and Jack Root, was it? Fought for the vacant title.
Was that legitimate? That was legitimately considered to be an actual title fight? Or more so a claim?
What's his name? He denied later that handed him a belt, but that dude was there.
Yeah.
I think Jeffries was there for the fight. So, and Hart had just beaten Johnson the year before. So Hart wasn't like someone with no good wins. Like Johnson was the colored heavyweight champion, but Hart did have a win over him. So he fought, I think, Jack Root. I'm pretty sure it was Jack Root of Chicago. Jack Root's not his full name. He just had an Eastern European name. I just can't remember it. But and so Hart won it. And then his next fight, he lost it to Tommy Burns, the Canadian Tommy Burns. Tommy Burns had a ton of title fights, but some of the competition was laughable. Not all of it, but some. Then Johnson took it. Johnson fought some tough guys, fought Tony Ross, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He fought Al Kaufman, who was a legitimate contender. I think he was like 17-1 or 18-1. He had a very good record when he fought him, and Kaufman had already beaten Bill Lang, who was one of the other contenders of the day. And Langford had fought Bill Lang in London in 1911. Langford fought Lang himself. Lang had fought Jack Johnson. He fought Tommy Burns twice. So he was like a factor. But like above guys on the Lang level were guys like Johnson, but not just Johnson. In Langford's era, these guys were doing a crazy amount as contenders. They couldn't get a title shot, but the battles they had between them were incredible. So imagine there's only one belt today, or in a great generation, right? But there's only one belt and there's less weight classes. there would be lots of fights with great fighters in their primes fighting for non-title fights. And that's what this era was like, and it was really busy. And so Greb, to some degree, was like a very powerful example of someone who could do a tremendous amount and just not get a title shot. Or get a title shot like with the O'Dowd fight, I think it was, right? He could only win by a knockout to take the title otherwise, and he lost. And some papers, I think, had it a draw, but he didn't get the title either way, but he would have had to finish the fight. He could win a decision and not get the title. That happened with Langford and the great Stanley Ketchel when they fought.
Oh, yeah.
Langford over 6 rounds in Philly, I think it was. So it's a no decision state. So Langford can only win the title claim by knocking him out. And there was a story, I don't know if it's real or not, but that Langford said he was threatened to not finish Ketchel, that there would be gunmen, New York gunmen in the crowd. And I don't know how much validity that has, but it wouldn't be that shocking. There's some powerful interests in play in boxing, as there always are in the leisure industries. I'll put it that way. So the first time that Langford was actually booked to fight Ketchel, this was before Ketchel was slated to fight Johnson. Johnson didn't like the idea because he's like, well, if you lose, you're not getting this fight. If you lose to Langford, you're not getting to fight me. I'm the champ. But Langford went to 6 rounds, and he wanted the long fight in the West Coast. And then Ketchel was murdered, and middleweight went all crazy, and all the different claims. It was a mess for a while, but still lots of great fights, whether or not there's a definitive world champ or not. Just, but there was just so much for schedule. So anyway, that was my Langford detour. It's almost mandatory.
Yeah, we have to throw Langford in the mix. I mean, his name rings bells in the sports, but in the sport in general. But you're right about that. But just thinking about that, Langford, and I know one of the things that we were talking about is just not even on the heavyweight scale. Just think about realistically where Langford came from. If I recall correctly, of course, when he fought Joe Gans, he didn't get a shot at the title because of the weight, right? But realistically, he could have been the lightweight world champion at that particular time. Just think about that, lightweight world champion, and then as he moved up, legitimate possibility of being the world heavyweight champion.
It's incredible, isn't it? And he also fought 15 rounds to a draw with the great Barbados Joe Walcott, who was a welterweight champion, but who had been fighting middleweights and higher since he was a lightweight. Like when Barbados Walcott in the early to mid 1890s, he was a lightweight prospect, and he was already fighting middleweights and sometimes even larger men. And then later in his career, he fought heavyweights, and he actually had an open challenge to the top heavyweights of his day. When he was in his prime, he posted 1,000, as was the custom. When you make a claim or a challenge, you post money with a newspaper of repute, which most of them were. The newspaper writers were important people in boxing, so people would leave letters with them for other boxers' management, or they would issue challenges through the writers. There was a lot of pressure on writers to not be full of it. That doesn't exist today.
Yeah.
You can straight up shill today, but back in the day, these men had responsibilities. Your career depended on being honest and rough, especially as lots of people are betting on these fights. So don't try to tell any tall tales. You just can't have a career that way. There was a lot of pressure on them, but so like with the Walcott fight, Langford won more of the rounds, but the ref, who was the judge, determined that the strong showing in the last several rounds from Walcott, the last several of the 15 rounds, made up for it, and so it was a draw. But Langford, a lot of people thought Langford should have gotten the welterweight title, and this was Barbados Walcott. This is one of the great fighters of the era that overlapped Langford's, but that preceded it. He was one of the, just like Bob Fitzsimmons, Joe Walcott was someone who was very small to have as much power as he did in his hands. Where Fitz was lanky, Walcott was short and stout, extremely so. I mean, look at him, he's a tank. Langford was of that class of fighter who could just fight bigger men. There he is with Big Bill Tate.
Wow.
Sparring with Big Bill Tate, but the idea that there have never been big heavyweights is off. It's just they don't generally carry muffin tops in this era. There are a few guys who were pudgy, but mostly the guys were ripped. The boxers were ripped. So,
Yeah.
you can be a cut, fit, ready to fight a busy schedule, 200 pounds, or you can be a slightly softer, ready to fight once, make weight, and then fight once, and then take 4 months off, 215 pounds, 220, easy, with the same frame. So like these guys had to stay. They would get in fight shape, and a lot of times they would stay in fight shape because in between fights they're helping each other prep for other people's fights. So, but Langford was of that mold, and Greb was as well. Where he let me circle back to Greb now, but he kept a crazy multi-weight schedule, and he did it in a compressed way. So Langford had just over 300 fights, but it took him from 1902 to 1926, with his busy years being, 1903 to 1924. So he had roughly probably 300 fights in those years. Greb, I think, what was it, 1913 to 26, 300 fights, a decade less, and he so he averaged a fight like something like every 17 days or something. I think someone posted on Reddit or on Facebook. He averaged through his career, he averaged about a fight every 17 days or so.
That's
That is
insane.
crazy. That really puts it in perspective. And that's how you can, but not just a schedule. Lots of guys kept a crazy schedule, maybe not in such a sustained manner, but there were guys who had crazy years. But to have the win-loss record at that level of competition, at that schedule, yeah, I can't think of it happening really, not in such a sustained way.
Yeah, I agree. That's what helps it stand out from the rest of the crowd because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of individuals or a lot of boxers out there who fight a lot of fights. Some of them are, more the journeyman type, all that stuff. But to be able to fight at that pace, at that level of competition, that's the type of thing that separates you from the masses. I would say, and I wanted to, yeah, just kind of go back on what we were mentioning about the newspapers and all that thing, and all that. One thing about the Times, and I know we've discussed this previously, is they were pretty much straight shooters there. So at least how they were calling it back then. So they didn't give fighters breaks. They were really on Dempsey, as you mentioned, for not facing Greb. I think back to John L. Sullivan. There were a number of fighters he didn't take on. But for instance, Peter Jackson, I remember there was a clamoring for John L. Sullivan to take on Peter Jackson, the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. So that fight never happened. But the public, the media, they were all asking and clamoring for that. Unfortunately, we never got it. But even during those times, these are all polarizing times. But those that were covering the fights, they were calling it straight. So they were giving credit where credit was due. And today, it's more about, and it's not always the case, but today, like the big thing that we hear reported and stuff like this, really just kind of just breaking news on certain fights that are signed, and that's what helps you sort of stand out from the crowd, I guess you can say, from a media perspective. But back then, that more in-depth analysis and how they were covering these things in the newspapers, that held weight to a high degree. So that's one of those things, you just can't duplicate. It's just different these days and how it's even covered and reported. And we have some good reporters and things of that nature out there, but just a different time in terms of what moves the needle in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And to get coverage in the days when newspapers were the primary vehicle for newspapers, word of mouth between the people, the rich patrons, and then also the betting public, especially the ones in your area. The guys who come out to every show, every fight, follow them out of the neighborhood or sometimes across the coast, bring their betting money, and they would go support their guy. It's like Greb had rabid fans. He had a legion of rabid fans, specifically from his neighborhood, because boxing was so deep that just representing your neighborhood was often they'd make a distinction between neighborhoods, not just the city. Sometimes with Langford himself, sometimes they would say, Oh, Boston Bone Crusher, Boston Terror, Black Demon from Boston. He had a ton of nicknames, but there were plenty of instances where they identify him as a Cambridge fighter, that he's from Cambridge, because there were other notable fighters like Joe Walcott and his brother Belfield, I believe, lived in Malden, a different part of the city. I don't even know if Malden was incorporated with the city at that point, but it is now.
Yeah,
Malden, and then so like Jimmy Walsh, I think he lived in Newton, which is out west of the city. That's like in the suburbs. And so Jimmy Walsh was the bantamweight who helped train Langford.
okay.
And so like these guys, so your neighborhood or your town was important, but also your city and your state and your country. So like there were whole multiple levels. And Greb was someone who had fans on a lot of levels, but especially rabid Pittsburgh area fans, because look at his schedule. You can just, if you think about it, you're seeing him in the newspaper all the time. Like, it's not like he fights and he disappears. It's like he fights and then a few days later there's either news of a booking or someone who wants to fight him or what he's doing or the news of his next fight. It's just different level of excitement. But this right here, this slide, this is 1911. This is the schedule of Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, and Sam McVeigh. This is when Jack Johnson was a champion, wouldn't fight them. That's the fights those three had between them. So if you were fans of like just the four great heavyweights, I don't think Johnson fought that year, but just those three great heavyweights, that's worthy, right? That's worthy of
indeed
of heightened coverage, because look what they're doing. They also fighting each other in there, so they're not, it's just another level of activity. And so the texture, as I've been studying this time, is fascinating. Just how much everyone was doing. It's so deep.
Yeah, and funny thing is, and I mentioned to you that I was kind of working on a video just looking at the colored world heavyweight championship, and just kind of chronicling the history there. But during this time, of course, even after Jack Johnson won the world heavyweight title, the colored heavyweight championship, those guys were still going on. They were still fighting each other, especially in light of not ever getting the chance to get a shot at Johnson while he had the world heavyweight championship. So it could be argued that at that particular time during Johnson's reign, the world or the colored world heavyweight title might have held more weight in the sense of looking at the competition and who was fighting for it. And these guys, I know at that particular time it was changing hands multiple times, generally between the same individual. So this was at a very high level with these heavyweights just routinely going at each other and all that stuff. So Johnson, of course, he continued to do his thing, but as you had mentioned earlier, the level of competition once he actually won the title and started to defend it, it waned in a bit. So there's an argument to be made that Langford, the Jeanettes, the Wills, the McVeighs and all of that stuff, this was really a deciding factor on who probably was like the top world heavyweight champion at that particular time. It's just unfortunate they didn't get in there with Johnson at that time once again.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if we think about it in today's terms, so if the heavyweight, so when Tyson Fury, after he beat Klitschko and he took a break, right, which we won't get into, but he took a break. So at some point, other heavyweights have won enough fights without him winning at all that they are considered the top guy in the sport. And so even though you could say he was the guy or one of the two guys, because I think Wilder already had his title at that point, but he was one of the two guys. He was the main one of the two. And then he left. So yeah, he's the top guy, like when Joe Louis retired or when Jeffries retired. So there is some question about the lineal, but at some point you haven't won enough to be considered the top guy. There's a question about whether you'd be the same guy. And so when Johnson was inactive, these guys were tremendously busy and they were fighting each other. So they really had their own little pyramid of excellence. And so at some point, Johnson was definitely the guy when he beat Burns. But by the next year, Langford and the others were fighting over because he wouldn't defend the colored heavyweight title. And actually, France and England wanted to strip Johnson. It didn't carry weight, because it's a U.S. thing, but like they wanted to strip Johnson for not fighting Langford or McVeigh or Jeanette. They had, because Jeanette and McVeigh were very popular in France, as was Langford. I mean, these guys, they were properly celebrated for the great things they did. But they fought these great battles and fought a bunch of other guys. So like I said with that graphic, Johnson took the year off. But the amount of fights the three of those men had in a year, and they all had severe winning records. I'm trying to remember. I think they only lost to each other, if they lost at all. Lost and drew with each other, but I think they beat everyone else they fought. I can't confirm that though. I'm pretty sure. But they had several years like that where they beating the field and then fighting each other. So whether or not, so Johnson had no fights this year. He had beaten Jeffries the year before. He took 2 years off. So at some point, someone else in a sporting sense is really the top operator, whether or not they have the official title. Just like when Joe Louis came back, was he the top guy?
Yeah.
Or was Charles already the top guy? And he was just proving it by defending it against someone who'd been a little bit out of action. So I see today's scene a little bit the same, but it's, like I said, it's several years compressed into one 12-month period. This is 1 year for those three guys. So if you split that up on a today's schedule, they would be considered the top guy the next year because of how many fights, how much success they'd had compared to someone who hadn't had any success and hadn't, because Burns was the champ, but he wasn't necessarily considered the best guy when Johnson fought him.
Yeah.
Johnson was considered the best guy. It was almost like a Greb Wilson thing, although maybe not quite as much. But because, Greb, it was just so extreme how many wins he had. But yeah, certainly the titles don't tell the full picture, but the colored heavyweight title specifically was reported in the press as such. It's a real title. It's a real, it's a proper distinction. And the lineage is intense. Yeah. The lineage is very intense. There were some great fighters who held colored titles. There were some great white fighters who didn't get opportunity because they couldn't fight for the colored title and they were getting stiffed for a world title shot, or they only got one in a long career. So there were lots of guys who didn't get their opportunity. It's not like it was just all the white dudes were loving it and then everyone else was miserable. Everyone was making money to different degrees by fighting a lot, and you could be very famous and well paid and have a big crowd and lots of supporters without being a world champ. You could be pretty popular in your area being a state champ or being the best in the city at your weight. I mean, these things counted a lot. It was just everything. There was so much going on. So I find it very gratifying to study and just celebrate. And I just want to quick shout out to Clay Moyle and his excellent book on Sam Langford. That was a photo of the book maybe 6 months ago. Right now, it's in tatters. It's been reread and referenced so many times since even then. It's destroyed, but excellent book. I'd recommend that to anybody, to everybody. If you're going to read a book on boxing, read up on Sam Langford. It'll help you understand why. And the book says boxing's greatest uncrowned champion, but the colored title really, like for me personally, when I look in the newspaper archives, the press would list the establishment champion, the colored heavyweight champion, both at the end of the year when they reviewed who the champions were. So that's good enough for me that I count those title runs and those titles. And in this time, by Johnson and then by Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, the colored title, and then Wills, the colored title was more hotly contested. Great fighters across the board, but as far as who their competition, this is the premier title in strictly a sporting sense, as far as how hard is it to get and keep it. But in other eras, and it's not because it just worked out for reasons that there were all these great black fighters all at the same time in that weight class, but in other eras, like if you ducked all the Jewish fighters, you would be ducking maybe some or all of the best at a certain weight at different times, or the Italian fighters. So it's not necessarily a rule that it has to be any one kind of people. I don't want to put the wrong idea across. But in this time, the greatest heavyweight fighters of that era clearly were almost all black men. Harder life, tougher, more desperation, real hard men. Langford was a real hard man. Like they all were, but Langford was especially, because he was small, he gave up so many dozens of pounds to great fighters and fought for years and years. Mid-1917 to 26, blind in one eye. I mean, that's, talk about fearless, right? But But I should probably flip back to Greb.
Oh
It's
yeah.
easy. It's easy to go on a. Oh, what's up, Hyphy? Hello, Rodolfo. You're back. What's up, brother?
Shout out Hyphy. Shout out Rodolfo.
Oh, Ranger Danger subscribed. Yes.
Ranger
Thank you, sir.
Danger. Check
Great
it
to
out.
have you. Great
Channel
screen
right
name. Great screen name. Yeah, I haven't really been very busy in like the podcast scene for boxing because I'm an MMA fan of the rabid kind, and so most of my ranting is on what's happening right now in MMA and in the Bellator League. But I have been sampling some podcasts, and Josh, I listen to yours now on the reg. That's definitely worth a listen. You and your friend, you're from Norway. I can't remember his name though.
Baz, aka Slavin. Shout out Slavin. Shout out
Slavin.
Baz.
Big up Slavin. Ho, ho. Yeah, that's cool. That's a cool show. You guys are chill, man. I really enjoy listening to work. And I always have scrapbook, and I have your excellent work on your channel 86 on 86BOXING, and then I have the Boxing Librarian. But I listen to some other stuff. I drop in on Bruce's chats and certain other ones, but I'm not really a regular too much anywhere other than just a handful of channels because I'm. It's easy to get distracted and not end up in the archives. I can't really listen to people talk about boxing while I'm searching through the digital newspaper archives. I need to keep my thoughts straight. So I have to pull myself away and I have to just like delve in. Especially now I'm working on the initial draft of a book on Langford on his early career. So that's going to be taking more and more of my time.
That's big time. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's a ways off, but I have a huge amount of information. I have some of the writing done. I have a decent sense of the scope as far as like I'm going to go from his amateur tournament at the Roanoke Club in 2002 through his loss to young Peter Jackson in mid 1906. And I'm going to cut it off there. And that's right before he went on that 35 fight unbeaten run, leading up to the close fight with Jim Flynn that was followed by a 21 fight unbeaten run. It's just incredible when he hit his prime or even got close to his prime. But I'm going to cover the part leading up to that because he had so many great wins in that time. Great wins, great losses, and already had some, as you know, it already had some excellent fight series. He'd already have some rivalries, multi-fight rivalries by the time he even started to go on that epic win streak or unbeaten streak because he had some draws in there. And for the uninitiated, like in this time that Langford fought in, especially early in his career, there were a lot more draws. A lot of refs had the opinion that a draw, unless someone clearly wins, it's a draw. And I've seen that in the papers. A couple of refs give their opinions on judging, and some of them were like no fighting, no hitting from the clinch. Like you can't tie up an arm and hit. Other refs didn't care about that. So there was definitely a lot of variation. Like you think it's crazy today. It was crazy then too. And there were a lot of different deals. Like we mentioned in our talk when we were talking earlier about Barbados Walcott when he fought, I think it was Kid Levine, right?
Yep.
For the American lightweight championship. But the rule was if he didn't stop Kid Levine, he lost. So he could win. I'm not saying he won every round, but he could win. He could have won every round, but with absent a finish, he lost. So it's a loss on his record under the contract. So so not all wins and losses are created equally. And, Langford himself, not long after he beat the great Joe Gans in 1903 in his first full year, his 27 fight full year, first full year of boxing, he had a prearranged draw with the great Jack Blackburn. I think it was a couple weeks afterwards. But even though it was a prearranged draw, Blackburn would have won a decision. The papers reported it as a draw sometimes, but they usually noted that Blackburn clearly got the best of it.
Yeah.
But it was treated a little different because that was I can't remember how many rounds they fought. Maybe they did fight 12 rounds. I forget. But
I think they might have went. One of them might have been 15. I think the first one was probably around 6. I feel like they might have had a longer one in there too in the mix. So I know they fought a good number of times. I just recently did a video on Blackburn, and of course Sam Langford is a staple of that. That's one of the great opponents that he faced, along with a number of others. But yeah, it was kind of the norm for the times. Those guys would go at it, of course, and yeah, with these prearrangements and things of that nature, you could put up a hell of a performance and all that stuff. But it only gets recognized as a draw in the end. Just think about that and the way they went through things of that nature and the amount of individuals who probably would be world or would have been world champions and recognized as such had it not been for some of the rulings around them having to knock out an opponent to actually win the title. Just think about that for a minute. Those are circumstances these individuals or these fighters today don't necessarily have to go through. Of course, judging and impartial judging and whatever other individuals may think about that. But that, is still something that plays heavily on the sport. But back then, there were so many other circumstances that could really alter things and kind of just change the trajectory of a career. And I was just thinking about earlier, we were talking about Greb, had it not been for, a couple of little chance shots, he could have put up this amazing record and never have gotten a chance to win the world middleweight title. Just think about that for a second. You got the Michael Dowd shot, but in a fight he probably could have theoretically won, but that ended up being a draw. And then just say if he never got that shot at Johnny Wilson, that could have altered history in a sense there. And you have this individual with this amazing record, having fought the best competition of anyone, and yet he didn't get a chance or a shot at the title. So today, you have the alphabet belt. So many people can call themselves champions, but there are certainly levels to it.
Absolutely, and it's complicated, especially with the no decision fights, and so it can be hard for a casual observer to get a gauge of the strengths and weaknesses of each schedule. But even that said, with Greb, his win-loss record is so remarkable. So if you just point out tough opponents, it's easy for someone to, if they're just exposed to it, to get a sense of the greatness of his ability and his accomplishment. Because Wilson isn't, and this is no disrespect to Wilson, who was a tough enough fighter, but Wilson isn't one of his 10 greatest opponents in his career. That was where he got the title from. But Greb fought a slew and defeated a slew of Hall of Famers, more than 10 individual Hall of Famers in his career.
Yeah, he may not even be in his top 15 greatest opponents, or even more realistically.
Well, if you count Blackburn, hasn't he beaten 15 individual Hall of Famers? So yeah. I guess 14 if you don't count Blackburn, who's in there as a coach, but really deserves to be in there in the Hall of Fame, like really does. But if you don't count that, even just being severe about it, like 14 individual and 32 wins over those 14 guys. And that's the most individual Hall of Famers beaten in boxing history. That's also the most individual wins. The most wins over Hall of Famers in boxing history. So Johnny Wilson, yeah, he's good. Is he among that list? Is he in that upper tier? No, because Greb also fought guys like Gumbo Smith, like heavyweight contenders. And so you just can't, just because you were a champion doesn't mean, even in a single belt era, or if there was a colored belt in a 2-belt era, just because you were the champion, you weren't necessarily the best. And it can be like that in more recent decades in boxing. Sometimes the guy who doesn't have the most prestigious belt, or doesn't even have a belt yet, is considered the best guy at that weight. Yeah. They just haven't sorted out the detail. They haven't made the fight yet to prove it. You know what I mean? So it's like sometimes there's a question, sometimes there's not thought to be much of a question, regardless of belt. And it was like that with Greb. He was, the way the press talked about Wilson was pretty intense. They were very displeased that he was hanging on to it. Because, there wasn't even a racial dynamic. It was just, they just wanted Greb with all that, with his fight style and all his great wins and everything. They just wanted to see those guys fight, get it over with, get Greb the title. Because if you think about it, what could be better than a champion who fights just a ton of fights? And with Greb, so he was really busy, but he was busy above his weight. He wasn't just fighting, you know, his own regular schedule. The guy, he just kept going. So when he couldn't get a title shot, he was supremely busy. And then he beat Tunney in 22 for the American light heavyweight title. But again, with belts, that particular win, Tunney's only career loss, even if some people thought the rematch, he should have also lost that to Greb. But officially, Gene Tunney's only career loss, and it's not even for a world title. It was for the American light heavyweight title. So how epic is that? Then he fights Hall of Famer Tommy Loughran that same year, fights the Hall of Famer Tommy Gibbons, Hall of Famer Jeff Smith. He's fighting Hall of Famers who, from middleweight, you know, and light heavyweight. Tommy fought at heavyweight. But, you know, he's fighting this crazy competition, plus all these other guys. Some of these other guys are bigger than him. And and he's getting older. Like, he's not as mobile as he used to be. So going into 23, you know, he's fighting at a disadvantage. But you see the only losses, he has 2 losses to the great Gene Tunney. And then he has a loss to Tommy Loughran, Hall of Fame light heavyweight, who was also, if I'm not mistaken, ranked at heavyweight as a heavyweight contender in his career. Because this is coming now into the ratings era, the ring ratings.
Mm-hmm.
You see the year after, 24, he's clearly past his best, but he's so incredibly good. Kid Norfolk gets the best of him, I guess a DQ it says in 6, but he's either successful and then he draws with Tunney and Loughran, but beats Tiger Flowers that year. It's just, you know, and then beats tough fighters like Jackie Clark, you know, like Jimmy Delaney. It's like, it's tough in context. This schedule is tough. It's not like some schedules where they look great and then you look at the details and it's not as impressive. Like these years I'm showing now, this is past his best years. Yeah. This 1925, he's past his best, and he beats 2 great fighters in July of that year. You know, Mickey Walker and Maxie Rosenblum, 2 weeks apart. Walker, just a great fighter at welterweight, who would go on to be a great fighter at middleweight, and even up all the way up to heavyweight contender, winning record at heavyweight. And then Maxie Rosenblum, who has one of the sickest resumes of all time, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. He fought it looks like he tried to fight everybody. Another 300 fight career, roughly 300 fights. And so, like, you know, I don't care how successful someone is. If you have 30 fights, when you're comparing them to someone like with Rosenblum's career, he has, or even some of these other fights like Gans, Benny Leonard, Langford, Greb. Mm-hmm. If you have to narrow their career down to 30 fights, some of them you have to start taking out champions and Hall of Famers or guys with amazing mm-hmm. records to get it down to 30 fights. 30 fights, you have to remove roughly 20 fights from Greb's record, because he had almost 50 against Hall of Famers, if I'm not mistaken. And Langford, if you don't count Blackburn, I think he has in the upper 50s. If you count Blackburn, I think it's 64, something like that, fights against Hall of Famers.
Insane.
So some of the guys, when they're very successful, but it's so small comparatively, it's still very difficult to do. But if something else is more difficult, then that gets even more praise. It's not really putting anyone down to say, hey, nobody today has touched even this year of Greb, and Greb was blind in one eye. You know, that's your whole career right there. Those are great wins. Like if that was someone's whole career, that's a respectable career. Win-loss record, only loss was above the weight to a heavyweight, to a light heavyweight turned heavyweight champion. Then he beats Mickey Walker, one of the great multi-weight champions in history, and he beats the great Maxie Rosenblum so badly that Rosenblum changes his style. Like how that's like after Calzaghe put it on Jeff Lacey, like Lacey suddenly becomes like a southpaw in and out fighter with, you know, with flurries and switching between wide and straight punches. It was like Rosenblum was so impressed. He was like, oh my goodness. Firstly, I wasn't ready for that. Secondly, I can learn from that. So great fighters learn, you know, they adapt. We see that today. We see guys adapt fight to fight. Like Fury especially between the first and second fight with Wilder, he fought vastly different styles. Same thing with Joshua in the 2 Ruiz fights. They're very different fights. And these long series, some of these fighters, some of these guys, not Walker, but some of the guys Greb he fought many times. So they would learn from each other, but they would also have a ton of fights in between sometimes. So they would have an opportunity to test it out in the ring. So at this kind of schedule, the learning curve was very steep.
Yeah,
you couldn't just come in with no experience. It's very rare for someone to do well against a fighter with this kind of experience, where Greb has beaten up so many men. What are you going to show him that he hasn't already seen at a higher level? It's crazy.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like just think about the amount of time or all the years he fought without getting a shot at the world middleweight title. And then when he finally gets it, he doesn't slow down. He continues to fight top level competition. Just think about the fact that he gave Tiger Flowers a shot at the world middleweight title. And of course, Tiger Flowers became the first black world middleweight champion. But think about that. This is Greb, blind in one eye, still fighting at the level of competition where he's taking on Hall of Famers. He's taking on the likes of Tiger Flowers in what ultimately was his final year of boxing, essentially. When he actually defended that title, or at least lost his title to Tyler Flowers. And I guess he died in 1926, right? Or is that the case?
I believe so.
He died. He died that year as well. But just think about that. Him being the fact that he was past it, but just still fighting the top tier, even after all those years of him not getting the chance to actually get a legitimate title shot. He didn't let that sort of sway what he did in the sport. He didn't let that stop him from defending the title against pretty much anyone. And just even as he came up, he was just a different type of fighter. He would fight anyone just in general. He didn't let anything hold him back. He was truly about his legacy when you think about it from that standpoint, because you pretty much name any top guy from that era. If Harry Greb didn't fight that person, then in all likelihood it was because of that boxer, not because of him, because he would fight anyone. It's crazy thinking about it.
Yeah, the only, like as far as middleweight and light heavyweight, he had no rules. He was like anybody. There are certain guys at heavyweight that it would just be maybe jumping. Like he would fight some heavyweight contenders, but like say like Harry Wills, like a prime Harry Wills, that's a different kind of level of, he wanted to fight Dempsey, and maybe if Wills had won the world title, he would have wanted to fight Wills. But as far as like just in general, certain guys, even Langford at this time, he wanted to fight everyone, but he didn't fight Langford because certain aspects of the matchup would be disadvantageous. I don't see any shame in that, considering he was building one of the greatest resumes ever.
Yeah.
Nobody, and especially because I'm talking about guys 2 weights above him, 2 full weights above him, not junior weights. And like in another era, so imagine you have 4 belts and then you have all the junior weights. Someone like Greb, I'm not sure where he was, maybe junior, so he might have been a champion at junior, middleweight, super middle, light heavy, and probably been able to pick off one of the champions at cruiser, and maybe even a weak heavyweight champion. I mean, he was that kind of good. And he fought a schedule. He would have been happy to just, if they would have let him, to fight in all those weights, if there were more belts. And so it's pretty remarkable. Like when you can say, like, there's this one of the graphics. I hope I loaded it. I think the one on the right here. Yeah, it's talking about the key contenders to Jack Dempsey. I think, and they're mentioning Greb and Tommy Gibbons. I'm pretty sure it's Greb and Gibbons in that. I can't actually tell. I can't zoom in enough in this format in StreamYard, but for certain it's Gibbons. I'm pretty sure it was Greb as well, but but we're talking, that's at heavyweight. Greb has no business winning at heavyweight. He can make middleweight. His second to last year, he made middleweight to fight Mickey Walker in that great fight. So it's, some guys and it goes way back. The great Barbados Joe Walcott right there, who fought, like the earlier part of the 1890s through through 1904 as this dominant wonder, but then he shot himself in the hand. He was out till '06, and I don't think he was quite the same. He was still very good, but he wasn't quite the same after that. But his prime was a long time, and he was remarkable across weights. And he challenged for the colored heavyweight title. He fought, even when he was early in his career, in his first several years, I was telling you earlier, he's a lightweight, and he's fighting middleweights already with winning records just to get fights. You know, he's giving up 12, 15, sometimes 20 pounds while he's a lightweight. So he's not a 200-pound man fighting guys who are 220, where you're all big guys. Yeah. He's literally 2 sizes smaller than some of these opponents, and still kept a winning record and was competitive in others, and just a ridiculously talented fighter and tough. And him specifically, he was able to use the top of his head. A lot of hands found the top of Joe Walcott's head trying to punch him, because he was a crouching fight. He was 5'1.5", and he was a crouching fighter. So he was really hard to hit. How do you even find the body? He's practically doing a push-up if he's crouching, being that short. So the big guys, you know, he could just jam his way in and attack the body like few others. And so even as a tiny guy weighing 140 something pounds, he's fighting some of these guys are like 200 pounds.
Yeah.
Just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, he was a marvel. He was a boxing marvel in a sense. I know that's, what is that? Jack Britton is his nickname, the boxing marvel. But Walcott certainly was a boxing marvel in some sense. I mean, talk about a list of individuals I want to see applying their trade. Yeah, if there was some video out there of him fighting, it would be amazing to see this 5'1" stocky fighter just taking out these bigger guys and all of that. I know he broke Joe Chowinski's ribs. You know, think about that. Joe Chowinski, same guy who knocked out Jack Johnson. Younger Jack Johnson, but albeit, you know, he was still a bigger guy, of course, by comparison to the likes of Walcott. But to think that Walcott broke his ribs, you know, that you're talking about some amazing body work. And I think that's probably what pushed him through, and the reason he was able to be so successful and great as he was. Just think about that level of body work he would have had to apply, just being at 5'1" and theoretically being the smaller fighter in every fight that he was in, you know. So he's definitely a force in the sport when you just look at the history in itself, and someone definitely want to I think it's good to always give him some shine, and there's a reason that his name has stood the test of time, and even Jersey Joe realized that as well, taking on his namesake. That's
right. Walcott, you know, at least at one point, Jack Johnson said that Walcott was the greatest of all time. And apparently Nat Fleischer and Charlie Rose both ranked Walcott as the #1 welterweight of all time. And Sam Langford said he never hit anyone more or ever got hit more by someone than in his fight with Joe Walcott. And Sam Langford says that, you know, I don't know if he's being sentimental. I doubt it. Joe Walcott was a ferocious fighter, and he was a short guy, but he was a powerful, powerful man, and absolutely fearless. And he came up in a hard time, and he faced a lot of adversity, like the fight with Kid Levine, where if he doesn't stop him, he loses. I think it was 15 rounds. If you don't stop him, however you do, as long as he finishes the fight on his feet, some kind of way, he wins for the American lightweight title. Like, that's pretty crazy. So sometimes the record, and oftentimes in this era, the record, you can't just look at a record and be like, look how many losses he has, because you almost have to look at the year-to-year record, because they were fighting seasons. So if they had 10 fights, okay, well, what was their record for that year? Was it 9-2? Or say they had 12 fights, 9-2-1 or something. You can still be the top guy in your weight class with the right wins, even if you've lost during that year, because it is a real season. Just like in the NFL, it's not that frequent to say the least, for like the top team to be undefeated all year, because they play a season. Soccer teams, you don't have to be undefeated to be the top team. And it was like that with fighters too. So Joe Walcott was the top welterweight in the world, but not a lot of the welterweights wanted to fight him. In fact, there were guys out there fighting for the white welterweight championship. Get that? So the establishment heavyweight title, the prestigious title, they have a colored heavyweight championship. But when Walcott and the great Joe Gans at lightweight below him, when they were the world champ, there were white dudes out there fighting for the white lightweight championship and welterweight championship. and some good fighters fighting for it, you know, for the claim, because there are a lot of claims, and there were things like fighters would fight for like the 158 pounds middleweight title claim, and then other fighters would have fights for 160 pounds American or world title claim. You know, the way they would bill the fights, it was a little more fluid in the pre-ratings era. It wasn't, although the establishment belts were what they were, but there was a lot of other stuff going on, and at different times there was support for that in places in the industry. So it just happened. People would make claims. So, shout out to Hardline. Thank you for everything. Great to hope we're a decent soundtrack to your morning coffee.
Shout
You're
out
absolutely
Hardline.
right. Yeah, man, and absolutely you're right. Walcott slapped this idea in the face of size being all used his small size to his advantage. That's right. Langford did. Langford probably learned so much from that fight. He said Langford always said, as you know, like he learned tremendous amount from fighting Joe Gans, and that was maybe 6 months before, or maybe a little more than that. Maybe it was 9 months, 10 months before, early in his career. But he learned so much from these guys, because Joe Gans is one of the, like, when you're talking about pivotal fighters stylistically, and also guys who just fought a who's who and were important, you could make an argument for George Dixon, Joe Gans, and Joe Walcott as the three top guys in that lead up to when Langford came into the sport. You know, Greb was a couple of generations was shorter then, because people would burn out so quickly, your average fighter. But so Greb was almost like a generation and a half later, many seasons later that he came in. But Langford came in, and Walcott and Gans were still the top guys at their weights and fighting above their weight. And Dixon wasn't, but those three guys were great. Langford fought two of the three early in his career when he was soaking it all up. It's just pretty incredible what he went on to do, because you could cut Langford off at the end of 1904, and he had a really good career. He fought more than 20 years past that. Hardline says 9 of Walcott's losses and 8 of his draws should have been wins. Yeah, he just fought unfair conditions, and there were things like, I know there was a no contest that he fought 4 rounds, and basically he had to stop the guy for there to be a result. Like, there was a wager. I think it was the guy bet $50 he could last 4 rounds, something like that. And so it's a no contest, but he still fought a guy. You know, it's some of these boxers like Fitzsimmons and some of these other boxers, they were doing a lot of sparring and exhibitions, public sparring and exhibitions. So they were doing more than just and training in the gym, training each other. And so Jack Johnson was helping one of the Sullivan twins train for a fight with Tommy West, I think it was. I think I had it wrong on one of the last chats, but I think it was, Jack Johnson was helping Sullivan get ready to fight West out in California, I believe it was. And so these guys were busy. Langford was busy. People were in each other's corners. People attended each other's fights. So someone like Joe Gans, who was so influential, lots of people got to see him fight because of his schedule, and not just fighting him directly. And so they were at the major fights. It was the texture was very closely woven. Walcott was one of these great all-time legends, just like Langford became, and just like Greb became, although Greb didn't have the same stopping power. He did more. He did more than Walcott in his career. Few ever matched Greb's resume, if anyone. But he wasn't the finisher. He was capable, but you know what I mean? He wasn't the finisher. There are certain guys like Walker moving up to fight him for the middleweight title. There were certain guys like with a slight size advantage, they'd be able to really put it on him. You know, because not everyone's power translates up. Although Walker could go, he could punch. Hardline. One fighter kept going to the floor every time Walcott let his hands go. He was terrified after 7 times. The floor in 4 rounds, the kid would not get up despite the ref telling him to over and over. Was that the one the ref then called it a draw? He wouldn't even call it a stoppage. Yeah, called it a draw. I saw that. Yeah, that's some of the. I've been doing a crawl this last week through Walcott's career. I go to BoxRec and then I start slowly crawling through his fight to fight, but then I go crawl to through each opponent's fight to fight and their opponent's fight to fight. It takes a long time, but I just skip back and forth and just try to get a sense of who is fighting who. Some guys are matched really tough, so the numerical record is a lie. It doesn't have anything to do with how good they are. Like you're familiar with Larry Temple at all? I know we've mentioned him for the Langford thing. Oh, Josh got booted out. That's all good. Josh, come back. Yeah, that's crazy, Hardline. Yeah, it's pretty spectacular. Greb, he fought a lot of guys his own size, but I don't think he had. Maybe you can tell me, yo, BL, did Greb fight a lot of people smaller than him? Because as Langford got bigger, he sometimes found himself fighting guys smaller than him. Did tremendously well in those situations, but Greb seems like, from what I'm looking at, certainly in the middle and later parts of his career, he was fighting his own size or larger. He wasn't really the guy with the size advantage, if I'm not mistaken, right? Anyway, you let me know. I think I talked Josh's ear off, and it fell off and hung up the phone on the way out. But just to circle back to late in Greb's career, when he had no business winning world-class level fights or fighting a ridiculous schedule and keeping a gigantic winning record. So he fights Walker, but then that's a great win. That's an actually great win. But then 2 weeks later, part of this overall busy year, he fights Maxie Rosenblum. Rosenblum's a serious dude. And he was more of a, I don't know if battling is the right term, but he could crack pretty hard when he was young. He was a little rougher in his approach, and it was actually the loss to Greb, to the sort of the chaotic finesse of Greb, that inspired him to smooth his style and be more elusive and use some of those rhythms that he had experienced firsthand. And that's the same thing Langford did after fights with guys like Joe Gans, and also some guys who got the best of him, like Jack Blackburn in their first fight, which is a prearranged draw. Blackburn clearly got the best of him. And that was reported. The press weren't going to conceal that. They were like, he was his master. They don't, and of course, you've got bragging rights, but enough guys fought each other. Lots of people were generating bragging rights. Like the same year 1903, that Langford beat the great Joe Gans, Blackburn, in a shorter fight, had also gotten the best of Joe Gans, and then in a prearranged draw, got the best of Langford. A New York area lightweight called Danny Duane had gotten the best of Sam Langford that year, gave him his only proper loss, decisive loss. Although one of the fights with Andy Watson, a very experienced fighter and teacher, he got the best of him in that, but I'm not sure what the official result was, if it was no contest or something, or a draw, prearranged draw, which just means you split the money. So there was certain fighters, if it wasn't a big fight, they would want a prearranged draw, meaning if you finish the fight on your feet, then you split the money down the middle. And then the bigger fights, sometimes the longer fights, they wanted them to go to decision. Langford fought a blend of both. And certain fighters like Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, their longest fight finished after 49 rounds, 1909 in Paris. And they fought two other long but not finished fights that year. So that was the middle of the three fights. They went 49 rounds in Paris. So that's quite a fight. Oh, 86. I had a power outage. Oh, man. Feel free to jump back on if you can. One week today. The middleweights can't wait. 1 week today. What's a week away? I think it's also worth mentioning, Greb, so he wasn't just viable above his weight. He was viable at championship level. Guys like Tommy Loughlin, like Maxie Rosenblum up there, and as well as killers at middleweight, his natural weight. Guys like, Jeff Smith, really serious people of his own size. But then guys like Gumbo Smith, he's a legit big guy compared to little old Harry Greb. It was so even if maybe Gumboat wasn't quite still in his prime, no Gumboat several years earlier had some fantastic years, but still he's given up just a lot of size. There's no business winning some of these fights, on paper, unless you look at what he's already done. But as far as like if you look at the dimensions of the two men, how big they are, just how big boned they are, their natural size, pretty crazy. Oh, the middleweights can't wait. I'm sorry, BL. See, I thought when I first saw it, I thought you meant there was a big fight coming up, maybe at middleweight or someone's leaving middleweight, so there's space for the other guys. So I was trying to think what's coming up, and I'm like, I have no idea. Of course, it is 1 week today. See, I'm still up from last night. You just got up. That's my confusion. So it's still, it's still Friday to me. It's still Friday to me. Yeah, our top 10 middleweight chat's going to be fantastic. Very excited for that, my friend. And I know Greb's going to feature in it. I'm sure Greb will feature in all three of our lists, me, you, and Scrapbook. But where? That's the question. Heck yeah, Rodolfo, that is going to be crazy. I don't even, I'm losing my mind trying to make sure I have enough graphics for whoever might make all these 10 lists, because there's only maybe 5 guys I can guarantee will be in all of our lists in my head. So who knows? It's going to be something, though. But separate from the graphics, I'll have some default graphics and some collages, and we'll get through it. It'll be fine. Plenty to talk about. But Grab especially, like he's got a feature on the list because, looking at Greb's record specifically, because he could always make middleweight. So a lot of times he's walking around as a middleweight or just a pound or two above middleweight, fighting at these higher weights. So in a kind of a top 10 list that has no set criteria, I know that I'm personally counting a lot when he's literally at that weight and fighting above it successfully at a Hall of Fame level, and then above that weight at a contender level. So some of these opponents, like if you go to BoxRec, you're looking at people's win-loss records. They don't always show the weights, even though they have a great database. It doesn't always show the weights. There's not always information, or it hasn't been brought to them or uploaded or whatever, how much each guy weighed. But a lot of times a guy like Greb with Sam Langford, certain other guys, Joe Gans, Joe Walcott, Barbados Walcott, the first Joe Walcott, the win-loss above their weight, I treat that a little differently than the win-loss against people their own size. And sometimes, like with Langford, he had more experience against larger men than himself in his career than he did against people his own size as he grew. The size of his opponents escalated exponentially, but so he was, 100. He was someone who could probably cut down to 150, but he was fighting all the way up, like just incredible. And the last time I got it wrong in my last chat, I mistakenly said it was the end of 1911. It was actually the last example I could find of Langford being very close to middleweight, what we would think of now as middleweight. It was the April fight with Sam McVeigh, April 1911. He fought Sam McVeigh in Paris to a draw. I think it was 20 rounds, and he weighed 161, and Sam McVeigh weighed just over 201. So it's just slightly more than 40 pounds difference, and he's fighting one of the great knockout artists of the era. But because Langford had so much power himself, McVeigh fought him on the retreat, jabs and left hooks, and McVeigh was very good at landing as he retreated. He wasn't just a come-forward knockout guy, although he had knockout power in both hands. But Langford gave up 40 pounds to a great, great heavyweight finisher and forced him to fight on the retreat. Quite incredible. But then after that fight, it looks like Langford just didn't cut weight, or he started to get heavier and heavier. But that's the last example I could find, because later that year he was coming in over 170. So, and then once Langford got up to like 175 pounds, give or take, he kept his speed at first, and then he had like exponentially more power. So that's when he really started just slaying people. He was just fantastically good. Only the very best could even last with him unless he was carrying them. See, Hardline. Yeah, man. Can't wait for next Saturday. Thanks, Hardline. Thanks for the shout. Have a great morning. I'm going to get off soon because it seems like Josh City, he lost power. Dolfo, it's great to have you here. Thanks for anyone stopping by. Thanks to anyone after the fact. Just a little chat about Harry Greb, and it's inadvertently become a talk about Sam Langford, but that's because I'm very interested in studying Sam Langford, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm past planning stages, but I'm in the research, accumulation, and draft stage of a book, an eventual book on Langford's early career. The part that hasn't got as much focus, Clay Moyle's excellent book, it's just so fantastic how it gets through a career that big with so much great information fit into there, but for practical reasons, it can't treat every fight with the same depth. And so the very, very early parts of Langford's career, where he's fighting guys who are more locally notable rather than on a national or international level, he has a lot of common opponents with other guys in the scene at that time. And so as Langford was moving his way up the weights from being a lightweight contender in 1903 and then a welterweight contender in 1904, then in 1905, welterweight/middleweight, but also fighting Joe Jeanette at heavyweight. 1906, he now contends for Jack Johnson's colored heavyweight title. So he's now fighting, but he's basically moving forward. He's a middleweight for a while who can make middleweight, but he's fighting all the way up to heavyweight, no problem. And that story is so epic. So Moyle's book is fantastic, but the early part of his career, there's more detail that could be. There's more information about how everything interacted with itself in the scene, the way that the different athletic clubs were booking and how many there were and which guys were headlining at which clubs and how being affiliated with the right manager could get you a lot more fights. It's like Langford's manager was affiliated with a club in Boston. Joe Gann's manager, if I'm not mistaken, was affiliated with a club in Baltimore. And the great Barbados Walcott, his early manager, Tom O'Rourke, had multiple clubs. So that's one way you get fights, is you've got a rich backer who's part of a club that's putting up purses. We're 86 Boxing back on the stream. Welcome back, my friends.
86 Boxing back on the stream. Welcome back, my friends.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, what's up? We got a loop. Are you on headphones?
Hey, how's it going?
We're on a delay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, your aces. Good stuff. Welcome back. Yeah, I drifted back toward talking about Langford. I was talking about the book. Yeah, you're good. The echo left. But like we were talking about titles, Josh. So when they this was the Bill Lang fight, 1911 against Sam Langford. And so this was Hugh McIntosh promoted this in London, and that was the same guy who promoted Jack Johnson's fight with Tommy Burns in Australia, and later would promote Langford's fights with the great Sam McVeigh in Australia. And they would have a falling out later. He would try to bring Joe Jeanette and Jack Johnson to Australia, and then Johnson was having trouble, so he tried to bring Jeanette in and put on a tournament to decide the new champion when it looked like Johnson might retire. So, but this is the fight. So McIntosh, they build Langford as the light heavyweight champion. He wasn't, but he was certainly of that caliber. There was no one his size on his level. He was a heavyweight contender, but just interested in how some of the claims, it wasn't as crystal clear. But then really there's so much title politics, like people being elevated to champion. And that's not new, but like people just being given a belt. So it's like, okay, you can be 0-0 in title fights and be a champion. Yeah, Rodolfo. Yeah, he lost his connection. They lost power or something. He had to come back on the phone.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can still hear you, brother.
Okay, cool. I'm back. Yeah, even when I first got on, it threw off my settings, that power surge and everything. But good to go. I was on my phone there for a second,
That's
and
cool.
I heard you mentioning varying things. But yeah, good way to keep it going, of course.
Just when in doubt, circle back to Sam Langford, especially all the time I've spent. But like we were saying with championships, like here's Langford with two of his trainers, right? So these are powerful fighters from the generation before Langford. They were mostly or all done competing, but in training by the time Langford started fighting. So that's on the left, that's Sam Langford. Then there's George Byers, who was like Langford is Canadian, and he was the colored middleweight and colored heavyweight champion in his day. And then to the right there is Bob Armstrong, who was one of the top trainers in the sport, but had also been the colored heavyweight champion in his day. So Langford was being trained by champions. He couldn't. So there's an irony there. He couldn't get a world title shot. He's the top contender to Jack Johnson, and at different times, him, McVeigh, and Jeanette were basically the top three guys for most of Jack Johnson's title reign. Most, not all. Al Kaufman had some good wins. So at some point, he probably peaked his way up into the top three contenders. He did get a shot, but Langford was being trained by champions. Like there was a championship lineage that Jack Johnson belonged to prior to Langford. Langford fought for it when he was 30 pounds lighter, but then when Johnson, after he won the title in 08, in 09, Langford was now fighting for that claim because Johnson wouldn't fight him for either. Wouldn't defend his colored heavyweight championship and wouldn't give his great black contemporaries title shots because he knew that the money, it was easier fights for pretty good money, the same or good money, fighting white hopes, fighting guys like Jack O'Brien, who was a past prime light heavyweight legend, not a Langford. And in 1911, Langford fought Jack O'Brien too and destroyed him with ease. A little bit after Johnson, but it was made look easy. Let's see, we got a couple comments. Let's go over here. Oh yeah. Just see, I'm terrified to try and post into the chat because I'm afraid I'll reset my browser on my phone and end the stream or something, or at least I get kicked out at a minimum. This phone is not a very good phone. But I'm gonna pull it back to Greb. Now you're back. I just defaulted over to Langford. Hold on, that's not even it. Oh, I pulled up my Bellator one. Uh-oh, don't get me started. Don't get me started on Bellator. Okay, here we go. I try to keep it mostly separate. Yeah, but real quick, let's go through. So the things that stand out about Harry Greb, there's a lot of them. So maybe we can. Obviously, he fought at the highest level all the way up to his death, not just to the end of his career. He fought to death, practically, because he was trying to get something repaired from the injuries from fighting that when he had the bad reaction to anesthetic and died. So Harry Greb fought from 1913 to 1926 when he died. And, it's very, I don't know if he had officially retired at that point or indicated he would retire, had a first retirement. You know how it is in the fight game, but that stands out. And doing it with one eye stands out, like doing a lot his later work with impaired vision. Go ahead and list a couple. What are some other things that stand out about this great fighter?
Yeah, that's insane. Just looking at this slide alone right here. This is what I was mentioning earlier, the fact that he fought Tiger Flowers at this particular stage. But yeah, the other thing is just the fact that he will fight anyone. I see Allentown Joe Gans on there, one of the many Gans. And, that just shows you that he was willing to take on any fighter, regardless of race or creed. And I think that's what builds legacies, especially a legacy like his. And when you think about the greatest boxers of all time, that all adds to it. I mean, this is stuff that can't be duplicated. Just looking at his resume alone, it's just like you probably will never see anyone take on the level of competition at the pace that he did. And just major commends for him for just going through that process and still remain at the top echelon of the sport continue to fight the best, even when you're not necessarily getting the rewards of a title shot per se, even as you're going through building up this record and everything. So many guys, they'll get discouraged even on these days. Here in the modern times, many guys get discouraged by the fact that, hey, I never get that shot at the title. And this a line, they have to wait in line. And we're talking, 4 belts, as far as the major belts, let alone all of the other different types of like smaller level titles that are out there and all that stuff. But these guys back then, you're talking 1 belt and a crop of fighters where the competition, there were just more fighters out there, so who knows the type of gauntlet one would have to go through to get to a title shot. And thinking about that, Greb was at the top of the echelon as far as the gauntlet. Just look at those names: Valentine Levinsky, Leo Florian Hawk, Billy Miss. I mean, come on, even and these are guys who are like the Hall of Famers, but just think about the others who weren't, like Soldier Bartfield, Fat Boy Willie Meehan. Like, he was another good fighter who traversed up the weights. He even had wins over Jack Dempsey, Willie Meehan. Definitely someone worth checking out.
Yeah, K.O. Brennan, couple wins over him at least 2 that I'm seeing right here on the right column.
Bill Brennan.
All in this, yeah, and some of these guys had also fought fights against the champions. So certain fighters, when they're avoided, they can fight the same or better competition as the establishment champion of their day. Langford did it. Johnson did it. After him, Langford, Jeanette McVeigh all did it. Harry Wills did it. Greb did it. Other fighters have done that where they build a resume. That's why when we look at the history, we try to judge the quality of fighter, not just were they a champion, because there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of, and in this time, at certain times, certain weight classes weren't as prominent as other times. So like when Bob Fitzsimmons held the light heavyweight championship, Bob Fitzsimmons was a huge star. When Jack O'Brien, who was himself a star, but when he won the light heavyweight championship, I don't think he even bothered to defend it. And so, it was like not everyone, because maybe there's more money for him at heavyweight. Like, people give up. So like, I think when Tommy Burns fought Jack Johnson, he got a giant purse, but I think he forwent another big, maybe a fight with Tommy Ryan to get, or somebody. There was something I was seeing in the paper. I'm a little confused. I'm a little tired at this point, but he had some of these fights. They have options for fights. After Langford smashed, I think it was Iron Hague. It was either Iron Hague or Bill Lang in England. Gunnar Moore, the British heavyweight champion at the time, or he was going to wait for Jack O'Brien. Like, that was a bigger fight for him, probably less danger, because Jack O'Brien was clever, but he could stop people, but he wasn't like a Langford, like a punching machine, like a destructive piston of death. So there are times when, like with Langford, he would go to an area, he would do so well that people wouldn't want to fight him. Greb didn't have the same stopping power, and he was a draw, so he was able to fight more of the top guys. Plus, he was a white dude, so at that time, who fought across race lines. So Langford did fight a lot of white dudes. He beat awful lot of white hopes into the ground. It wasn't just Johnson at this time. Guys like Jeff Clark, Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, and others were beating a lot of white hopes. Basically, guys, prospects. That's all it is. You're a prospect, and you just happen to be a white one in an era with a controversial black heavyweight champion, and most of the top guys are all black dudes. So guess who you got to go through? Yeah. And it's hard to build a resume to get there. Al Kaufman did it, but it's hard to build a resume to get there without going through those guys, and they were too good to get through. Mm-hmm. So that's why you had, Johnson fighting Tony Ross, who Langford had already smashed the year before, or fighting Jack O'Brien, who wasn't really at that level at heavyweight. He was a great fighter, but he was past his prime, and he was more of a light heavyweight legend. Yeah. Fought Stanley Ketchel, who was a middleweight. So, Langford wanted to fight him too. He was a middleweight, but like Ketchel, as hard as he didn't hit Langford hard. And he was a smaller person at that point. Langford had a beefy chest. You know, he could generate some real power. Greb didn't have that, and also obviously because he was white, so he was able to fight, and because he was willing to fight everybody, so he fought great boxers of Eastern European descent, of you know, various like Jewish descent and Italians, and he fought a bunch of great black fighters. Like he just was fighting everybody. He was so driven. And because he was a big name with a big fan base, he did get some opportunity, just not for that world title, not until too much time had gone by for him to be at his best. But he was still the best. How about that? You know, like Klitschko, right? So when Klitschko lost to Fury, he was considered the best, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was considered the top heavyweight out there for sure. Long time running.
Was he 36 or 38? I can't remember. He was in his upper 30s, right?
Yeah, he was definitely in his 30s. Yeah, he might have been somewhere around that range. Yeah, I can't remember exactly what his age was, but yeah, I think he was on that sort of back half of 30 for sure.
Right. So, but still considered the best because it doesn't have to be because it's a weak era. Sometimes someone has the attributes that carry them past their prime, their physical prime. Like you mentioned off air, Bernard Hopkins. Like, dude, that guy was so competitive at the highest levels so late in life. But it was because his skill set translated. He's like, well, I'm an expert at, I know every trick and I know how to slow down a fight and frustrate someone's style. You can look at Joe Calzaghe. He was more of a volume fighter, to say the least. But even when his hands were ruined and like in the Lacey masterclass with an injured wrist going into the fight, he was able to elevate his game. And he had a style where he could go on points easily, just pile up points in a way like Greb, like without necessarily having the hands to have the stopping power or setting his weight in a way and taking the higher risk. But he took risks. He was a come forward fighter, but even when he was up on the cards, he would come forward endlessly. But he wasn't necessarily the threat to stop somebody all the time, especially when his hands were tender. But he could win. And so Calzaghe did his best work past his prime, past his physical prime, but his fight game elevated. And Greb must have done that himself to stay competitive, often with a size disadvantage at the highest levels when he couldn't see properly. Had to make some adjustments. He must have been very clever as well as very experienced. A thinking fighter, even if he was controlled chaos, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the amount of fights he had, I mean, you just think about that repetition. You can't really teach that. You can't teach that type of repetition. You're talking 300 or more fights, you know, realistically. Who knows? It could have been well above that. You know, just thinking about the stuff that may not have been reported or probably isn't known. All of that repetition, that certainly adds up. And just think about the opponents he faced. There's a stat that jumped off my mind only because, you know, I was mentioning that the Greb video that will be releasing soon. Essentially, if I recall correctly, in 1919, between his fights with Billy Misk, battling Levinsky, Jeff Smith, and there's another fighter or two. I can't remember the full names, but basically, I think it was just those Hall of Famers. It might have been Mike Gibbons, and so yeah, Mike Gibbons was another one, and there was one other, but they're combined. So yeah, here we go. So yeah, battling Levinsky, Leo Hook, Billy Misk, Jeff Smith, and Mike Gibbons. I think those are the ones that I counted up by virtue of them being in the Hall of Fame, but they had a combined career total of 919 fights. Let's think about that. Put that on for size. These guys finished with a combined career total of 919 fights. That's the type of experience as a fighter that you just don't see today. And just think about Greb being in with the likes of these guys. And this is just 1 year in terms of him competing with them and what they would go on to do, what some of them had done, what, of course, he would go on to do beyond this year, what he had already done up to this point. I mean, that's just the type of repetition, type of competition, and just level of overall just involvement in the sport and competing at such a level that's something that can't be duplicated right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And even like Hall of Fame is a high bar to set. Like if you put that standard across everyone up to say the last 10 years, because I know there's an eligibility waiting period, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but like everyone else in history, and you look at how many Hall of Fame fights they have, a lot of them are from the early era because they were so busy. Everyone was so busy. There was a mechanism to produce fighters with fantastic winning records and tons of experience while they were young. So you have more great fighters because the sport is bigger and it's more thriving. It's still really good today. The quality of fighter is good. It's still thriving in a different way, but it doesn't produce as many all-time greats. The structure produces a lot of great fighters and powerful competitors, but it doesn't produce as many all-time greats because there's a limit on how much they can aim for. Like you have to weigh inside the weight class, if I'm not mistaken, to compete in it. So if a middleweight wanted to go fight a heavyweight contender, would they even sanction that fight? It's a genuine question. I don't actually know.
Yeah, I know that there were, in all likelihood, you'd probably run into some issues. I'm sure you can find a state that would, Florida being one that comes to mind.
Yeah,
but in
right.
all likelihood, it probably wouldn't happen. That being said, it would depend on, how they packed on the weight and everything. Well, I guess it comes down to the physicals really, and then the doctors approving it. If they go with it and the commission approves it, regardless of whether you packed on the weight in the right way, maybe it doesn't even matter because heavy or Canelo, he was talking of going up to cruiserweight, all that stuff. Think about Roy Jones when he went up to heavyweight in some capacity or whatever, but he packed on the weight in a proper fashion and everything. But I think they could certainly make it happen, but it probably would depend if they're just the middleweight champion as they are now, and they would factor in the level of the fighter that they were going to face as well. So some of those things would certainly factor in, because I think about Jaime Munguia, who's a younger fighter at the time. He wanted to face Triple G some years back, and this was while Triple G was kind of at the peak of his rise or whatever, or at least on that same trajectory. And Munguia was a younger fighter. He was bigger than Triple G, but the athletic commission denied it. I want to say this might have been or Las Vegas. I believe it was either Vegas or California, but that goes to show it kind of can vary just depending on the state, and some states are more lenient than others.
I see. I think in a rich era like the one we're talking about, and going back to Langford's era, these are very rich eras, lots of busy fighters, lots of places to have fights, lots of purses available for people to fight and earn, and the incentive of not really media rights not being worth much for most or anything for most boxers. So they got to fight. Yeah. You got to get in the ring. And so, but like Greb's just like, well, I'm going to fight Gumbo Smith. I want a title shot at Dempsey. I'm going to just fight him. Like he's still a middleweight. Like he can make middleweight. He makes middleweight very easily because he's fighting a busy schedule. So he can't go like, I'm going to put on 15 pounds of muscle and I'm going to go up and fight Gumbo Smith in 4 months or 6 months or a year. He just jumps up and fights heavyweights, jumps back down, fights middleweights, jumps up, fights light heavyweights. And at the middleweight and light heavyweight level, we're talking Hall of Fame level in and amongst this other stuff. Like fighting someone like Jeff Smith. Jeff Smith was extremely difficult to fight. Very tough, very clever, very tricky, and knew a lot of the tricks and was adaptable. A lot of these great fighters, even Greb showed, yes, he's a volume fighter, but later in his career, he had to fight a different way. Jeff Smith could switch it up during a fight. These guys were, they weren't, so like Greb didn't need to go through a long camp to get ready to fight Gumbo Smith. He was like, okay, he's a big guy, he's slower, okay, so I have to look out for certain things. Certain angles are different. The power, there's a different ratio of risk to reward on certain moves, and then he just go beat his butt and just go do it. But then he might come down and fight Jeff Smith, at middleweight, and then maybe Tunney's in the mix, like whose first time was light heavyweight, but he probably, if he came in at 174.5, he might well have cut to make light heavy. He might have already walked around as a heavyweight. Greb walks around barely above middleweight. Cuts just a handful of pounds to make middle. Like he never struggled. Oh, and then go fight Tommy Gibbons. Fight these just great fighters, and then Why not? Theodore Tiger Flowers, just fighting across racial lines, just fighting everybody, trying to literally kick every ass he could find. And lots of fighters have done that, like Joe Walcott, who we mentioned, did a lot of that. But Greb did so much of it, packed it into so many busy seasons. It's almost too much. But there are other greats, like Jack Dillon on the left there. He fought above his own weight. A great fighter, had a huge schedule, a high level of competition. I mentioned earlier battling Levinsky. He tried to fight everybody, properly fight everybody. Maxie Rosenblum did his level best to fight just about everybody, like certainly a brutal schedule. And that's why these guys are sort of remembered, echoed through, whereas someone like Johnny Wilson, who was a world champ for some time, he is not remembered amongst the all-time greats, because when you look at his resume, it isn't on the level of these other guys. Whereas if then you go look through Maxie Rosenblum's his ranked opponents, it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, insane record for Maxie. I mean, and the fact that he had to actually legitimately box his way through the majority of those wins, talking about 300 plus fights, really. And he wasn't a knockout artist, so he was a boxer in the pure sense. And look what he was able to do. I mean, that's just stuff like you can't make up or duplicate that type of activity. I mean, it's just something that you just won't see again. I mean, at that level, you won't see anything like that again.
No, that's not possible. And shout out to Con Shonry. I love that name. I love that name so much.
Con Shonry.
Yeah, and he says Roy Jones was big enough to push the envelope, though. Canelo's too small to compete with light heavies. Cruiserweight to heavyweight would be suicide for him. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Jones had a frame that could take a little more on it, I think. But Canelo, it's also, his particular skill set may not translate any further above his weight, because he was smaller than Kovalev too, right? He gave up size in that fight. And the body shots, I love that performance. I've enjoyed his fights. I don't hold it against him that he lost to a champion at a higher weight, because pretty much even if there are multiple belts, if you're a champion, you're still like probably a top 5 in the weight class, regardless, with maybe only bare exceptions. So that's still a good win. Talking about a larger size human being going in a fight, and size is just an inherent advantage.
Yeah.
So I respect Canelo, and I love his schedule. He says Canelo has that one victory against past prime Kovalev, barely won a round against Bivol. Yeah, and Bivol's a serious dude. That was he proved himself in that fight. He elevated his game to fight one of the absolute top boxers in the world. So credit to both of them. One for aiming high, but also full credit to Bivol, because history's full of guys giving up size, and they don't all lose. So yeah, just good. I'm just glad to see guys trying to aim high. I just admire it a lot.
Yeah.
Khan says, yes, a common tale. When athleticism, flexibility, and reflexes are slow, they need to adapt other techniques to remain competitive and maintain defensive skills. Yeah, absolutely. And not everyone's like a Calzaghe, who just seems to get faster as he gets older. But most of the guys, they have to, like George Foreman did a great job.
Yeah, that's a great example.
As he got older, the Archie Moore influence, coached by the great Archie Moore at times.
The great Archie, without a doubt.
Archie Moore, one of the most unheralded all-time greats. I mean, he's famous, but he's unheralded compared to what he did in his career and the adversity he overcame. I mean, he's another guy who got screwed for a title shot, and when he finally got it at light heavy, screwed a middle. When he finally got it at light heavy, he was already old, and he just kept it for almost a decade, and fought up at heavyweight in that time, but he kept the light heavyweight title. Just one of the all-time greats, and then became like a mentor and a real proponent of boxing for young men to build character, and just great on so many levels. Archie Moore, one of the all-time greats. So George Foreman had some of that influence, and when George came back in a more humble and cerebral mode, he used a lot of that cross-arm guard, which had been used going back. Moore just practically perfected it, but Big George, with his size and his toughness, he was able to employ that and won a piece of the heavyweight championship as a very old man. It's incredible. Yeah. And actually, real quick, I didn't mean to skip you, Rodolfo. Sorry, brother. He said Hopkins was so good that when he won the undisputed middleweight championship in the tournament, people were doubting him, calling him old. Little did they know he still had a lot more to go. Yeah, and even when Calzaghe beat him, they were like, yeah, but that's old Hopkins, and he wasn't done then.
Yeah.
He still wasn't done. He was like, he was just so good at taking the fight into his realm. Brilliant stuff. Khan says George Foreman reinvented himself in an incredible way. He actually perfected a jab in his last fight against Shannon Briggs at Rivalry loss, in your opinion. Oh, I'll have to go watch that fight. I don't know if I've seen it. I've been watching a lot of James Toney. All the way from young James Toney, young, fast, sharp James Toney, but very relaxed, to old, rotund Toney, who was still very clever. I just kind of like watching him fight. I'm not sure what I find compelling about it, but
Crafty individual.
yeah, and there are other guys, but there's, the commentary for his fights I like as well. Sometimes it helps me if the commentary is right. That's partly why that Calzaghe fight against Lacey is so great. The English guys doing the commentary were just loving life. But also the American commentary for Calzaghe's fight against Kessler, where Kellerman was hating on him and had to just eat shit because the fight turned against, or Roy Jones fight. No, it was more the Roy Jones fight, but it was also the early parts of the Kessler fight. Like, I enjoy that. I like the commentary adds, and actually Mauro Ranello for MMA, for mixed martial arts, he's my dude. And he's with Showtime, so he does the Bellator shows, which is a dream come true for me. That's like just like Strikeforce all over again, which I know you also enjoyed.
Certainly.
Short-lived but great. Let's see. Aliu Musa says the way Canelo fights won't translate to fighting bigger guys, in your opinion. Yeah, and you may be right about that. Certainly at the very highest level.
Yeah.
But it's hard but it might be below the highest level, because like Greb didn't fight the top heavyweights. He didn't fight Wills, or George Godfrey, or like some of these guys who were gigantic, even though he wanted to fight the establishment champion. But he did fight guys like K.O. Brennan, and Tommy Gibbons was competitive at heavyweight. He was competitive all the way up through the weights, but Gumbo Smith, he did fight guys who were factors, but that didn't mean he could beat a Harry Wills. I wouldn't pick Greb to beat a prime Harry Wills, like in the late teens, early 20s. Like, no way. Certainly. You can be elusive, but a guy with an 80-something inch reach whose experience came against some of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Like, Harry Wills built a career, you know what I mean? Like, he fought some dudes on his way up. So no wonder he was so great, because he was physically gifted, long-limbed, and tall, but also came up against just a row of killers. So when he hit his prime, there's not a mistake that Dempsey ducked that fight hard. And it's a shame in a way. Dempsey's remembered for a lot of different things, but one of them isn't how hard he ducked Harry Wills to the point of embarrassment. If you have a state basically like, well, you can't fight here because you won't fight, because there were rankings at that point. By some way into Will's contendership, there were official rankings, and he was the number one. I think for at least the first 3 years of the ring ratings, he was the top contender to Dempsey.
Oh yeah, was it New York who banned him?
I think they said, he was in a dispute with them, and I think they said that he couldn't. I saw an article that was talking about people wanted to strip Dempsey, calling him for being inactive, and then maybe he would fight the winner of someone who was fighting for the title to settle it all after.
Yeah.
It depended on the money, because it's about promoters putting up enough money for the different things to happen, and then the fighters also being in agreement structurally, like what their goals are. But like we were saying, the champions don't always do the best work, or I should say the establishment champion wasn't always the guy with the toughest schedule.
Yeah, certainly. It was more about the money at that point. And, you had those rare fighters, of course, who put legacy overall. But yeah, Dempsey, of course, became a bit inactive after he had won that title. So that was like the achievement. And of course, he no longer had that same grind in some sense, especially around the time he ended up fighting Tunney. He had been about 3 years removed, or just about 3 years. So it was really going to be a tough task from the jump there.
He has business acumen. Like as a businessman fighter, Dempsey, Floyd Mayweather Jr., certain fighters really got the goods out of their careers. Businessmen fighters, but fighters like the actual competitive athletics. It's just like if you pay a wide receiver in the NFL, if you pay a wide receiver $20 million and he only plays one game and he sits out, you pay another guy $500,000. Well, that's less than the minimum, but pay another guy $1 million and he has the best season in football that year. Okay, so businessman, athlete. Well, that guy only played a couple games and he made 20 million. He made, a multiple of what the other guy did. But sporting wise, no, he's not better than the other guy. That's what this is about. I don't care about money. Guys like Greb, the schedule. The schedule is what I care about. Hey, Aliyu Musa says a version of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre has, in his opinion, the best commentary ever. It makes the fight so much more dramatic. I wonder if that's the revoicings that I'd heard when Tyson was young. Customato had tapes that a family friend had done his own. One of the great commentators did one of his own series of commentary on fights himself after the fact. I wonder if that's what he's talking about. We'll go check it out.
Could be. Yeah, I've seen that, but I don't recall the sound or any sound bites or whatever. But I've seen a lot of stuff, so could just be missing it in my memory.
Yeah, and Greb, there's some all-time fantasy fights. Some of them in his era, like Greb Dempsey. From what reports said in their sparring sessions, Greb was his master. Like he just couldn't figure Greb out, which makes sense because Dempsey had a certain approach that worked really well. It worked, he had a lot of power and that sort of like sweeping up into hooks and that sort of style that worked really well against a lot of guys. He was fantastic, ferocious.
Yeah,
but Greb. But if you're coming in that manner, Greb was nimble enough and clever enough, even past his prime, he was nimble enough and clever enough to punish people for simplistic styles, even if they were very effective and simplistic. He could figure that out. He was a chess master. If you come in checkers, even if they're big checkers, you're going to have a rough night. And so it's not surprising that after they sparred and Greb did so well, that Dempsey was like, yeah, right. And he had already beaten other guys that were in Dempsey's realm, like that Dempsey either fought or who were contenders to him. So, the champions at this time, he was a good businessman, but he was coming off Willard's largely useless title reign. They came off Johnson's big money, but also somewhat useless title reign that came off of Burns' mixed title reign. Really, like if you're looking at establishment title reigns, Joe Louis did it right. He won. He became the champion, and then he went out and tried to fight everybody, practically everybody, at a furious schedule. The war interrupted his efforts, but that's interesting. Aliu says, ironically, the giant killer had problems with smaller fighters, Carpentier, Gibbons, and Greb. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, and Langford himself said he liked fighting big guys as well. Greb wasn't the only one. Langford said because the small guys were so fast. And I think that was some of his experiences in the lower weights. But he had so much. Langford himself had so much power, like by his prime when he was up in 175 range, that even a little guy, he could just walk. He could run through someone if they were too small. He didn't even need to walk. He could just run through them because he was practically invincible to the big guys. But there is a point where, like, some guys do better against larger fighters. They like the speed differential more than the power differential. Other fighters the other way around, they don't mind being smaller because they hit harder, like Langford. But Greb was something special because he had to fight, like you said, Joshua. He had to fight a lot of rounds because he wasn't a finisher. His fight style didn't produce as many finishes. He was capable of fighting in that way, but his technique led to a lot of decisions because he fought a lot of tough guys who could make it the length. So he really had to be good. This is something BL's mentioned in his live chats, that Greb fought a lot of rounds. He didn't have that Langford stopping power to finish fights and get out of there. Like Archie Moore is another one. Huge resume, one of the all-time greats, probably a top 10 all-time great. Certainly in the argument for the top 10.
Certainly.
And a finisher. 120 something, was it 127 or 128 knockouts.
Oh yeah, for some reason I was thinking 132, but
Oh, he might be. Who am
somewhere
I
in that
thinking? I'm
range.
thinking of Langford. My
Somewhere in
fault. I
there.
think Langford's around 127 or 128 no knockouts. Yeah, that's right. Moore's even higher than that. So these guys sometimes, who knows how many rounds they would have fought if they were more of like a decision machine type fighter. And I'm not saying Greb's a decision machine, but he definitely had a lot of decisions. He wasn't incapable of stopping people. It wasn't for any lack of ability. It was that he had such a furious attack, and he was often giving up size. Yeah, that's right, Con. Greb handed Tunney his only career loss, and in their second fight, a lot of people thought he should have won it.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, and then by the end of their rivalry, Tunney was the master. But he was big, and Greb was half blind and old. He wasn't he was only 30 in his early 30s, but he was fight old. See, Khan says it was Jim Jacobs who was Tyson's original manager who added commentary to his old fight films. Oh, it's Jim Jacobs. Jacobs owns the largest archives on record. I think I've seen those on YouTube. I love watching the old fights with the commentary. Yeah, Tunney got his nose broken in the first round. I think he might have even got knocked down, but he fought on and he tried to make a comeback in the last 3 rounds, but he was a mess in that fight. I'm sure he learned a lot. He was a studious fighter. I'm sure Tunney learned a lot, He was a great fighter. Greb just had access to so many greats. And, in a more modern era, what do you think, Joshua? You could say like Ali, Ray Leonard. McLaren's actually old school himself, but Ali, Ray Leonard, some of these guys have access to a lot of great fighters. But the degree to which Greb had it is just pure insanity. I think Joshua lost power again, too. I'm out here speaking to oh yeah, there we go. There's a comment. Oh, what's up? Here, I'll put you up on the screen. Next best thing, brother. Yeah, that's right, Con. Tunney was very intellectual. Yeah, and he was a thinking fighter. And Greb was an improvisational genius and had so many qualities and was so fight ready. But Tunney was great in his own right. Even though he didn't fight as tough a schedule as Greb, he kept a fantastic record as a professional. So respect to him. I don't rank Tunney as high as Greb all time, but it's not because Tunney wasn't hugely successful. Just based on the level of competition overall, the numbers. But they were both great fighters. That's the thing. They're depending on criteria. There are lots of greats like this talk coming up on the 11th with the boxing librarian and Scrapbook Boxing, where we're gonna do each of our top 10 middleweights of all time. But we haven't set a criteria at all. It could mean anything. It doesn't have to mean the largest resume or the best individual wins or some kind of statistic. It doesn't even have to necessarily mean that they spent a long time at middleweight. We didn't really set a criteria. I respect both of these guys enough that I'm just going to ask them at the beginning what greatness means to them and perhaps also what it means in the context of this talk. And then we're just going to start at 10 and each of us go down through our list. Hopefully I have slides ready of everyone. There are guys who aren't famous today who are definitely in the discussion, like the great Jeff Smith, real name Jerome Jeffords on the right there. A lot of the top fighters in this rich era gave him tremendous credit, and he has a fantastic resume. He fought at really high level, a lot. So he's one of the guys who might not make a casual list of top 10 greatest middleweights, because there's some very famous legends who did some work at middleweight. But if you're looking at a middleweight resume, Jeff Smith's a guy where he's got to at least be on the possible list. And certainly Greb's going to be on the list. He's going to feature heavily, but because as he was a middleweight, he's fighting guys like Battling Levinsky. He's fighting like legendary light heavyweights and being avoided heavily by the champion. But because Greb's strength of competition was so high, that was the technicality almost the way it was being discussed. Like, oh yeah, at some point he'd love to fight Wilson. Can't wait to see him smash that guy. Because I don't think Wilson did himself any favors avoiding the fight, because And from what BL said in one of his live streams, he had some trouble getting fights. He wasn't as busy because it's not a good look when you're obviously ducking. And it's not like where Jack Johnson had a built-in drama of the White Hopes to propel his numbers, even if he avoided his top contenders. That wasn't the case with Wilson. He didn't have some extra layer of racial tension for money making. But Greb was, you know, he was great. He was great above his weight. He was also great against guys from smaller weights. So like he was firmly settled into middleweight and above, and then Mickey Walker moving up to fight him. Mickey Walker was a great fighter, and he carried a wallop up the weights. He was a serious dude, but Greb was able to get it done in a very hard fight. And this was a time when Greb, you know, a normal fighter would not have had that success. See, Rodolfo says, I used to hate whenever the power go. Oh, yeah. Losing the power. That's never fun. Conshani says, absolutely. It should be a broader metric applied to rate these guys. I saw a boardroom discussion with Archie Moore, Angelo Dundee, Georgie Benton, Don Dunphy, and they discussed Dempsey and Tunney. They all collectively agreed on Dempsey as the better fighter. Yeah, and I think we can say Tunney fought Dempsey when he was past his best, because it's about staying in shape to fight. Greb was never inactive. The year in 1919, he broke his hand. He took a few weeks off, but he was never inactive, whereas Dempsey and Johnson had done it, Willard did it. They had times when they didn't fight for a year or two, 3. It's just not the same if you're living a comfortable life instead of fighting. It's just not the same. People can still come back, but it's not the same sharpness. There's something even someone as great as Muhammad Ali, after a break, you can still be great. You can still be the best. You can still be one of the greatest, but maybe you're not quite what you were. That happened with Sam Langford after he got back from Australia. So like going into like 1913 and beyond, even though Langford was still incredible, he was a little bit heavier, and he started sometimes coming heavy on fights and be a little less mobile. So part of Langford's thing was he had the heavy artillery, and he was short, so he was hard to hit. He could crouch if he wanted to, and he had counters, and so he was hard to hit. He was at a low angle. It was easy to punch him in the top of the head and hurt your hands, and he could take advantage of that. He was also very mobile for his power. So we had some overlap where he was putting on weight and he stayed fast. But then later on, when he came back to the States, you know, the fight with Gunboat Smith in 1913, he was a little bit heavy. And when they rematched, I think it was the next year, he came in superb shape. So he was still capable of being in great shape, but it wasn't a given. Whereas previously, he was always ripped. Conshonry says Dempsey had long layoffs toward the end. Yeah, he did. And Willard wasn't active. And Johnson took a couple years off. Like that 1911 slide I had, Johnson didn't fight. He took a break a couple years after he fought Jeffries, made all that money. He was living it up. But Langford, Jeanette McVeigh, and the other guys were doing crazy work. So I just rank sports. So I hold what they did higher than not fighting and driving around in race cars, of course. Just in sports, not in business, not in it, fame, just sports. 86 in the chat. That's funny. Roles have reversed. Okay, 86, I'll put you on the screen. Willard's reign wasn't good at all, but he did overachieve. Kudos to that, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, beating Johnson, even like late edition Jack Johnson, when he probably wasn't at his absolute best anymore. It's still intensely good. Big credit to him. Just among the various champions, being inactive, being really inactive for time when other guys are really active is no good. So that's another reason Willard is not really remembered amongst the great champions. He's remembered for his pivotal role because of the transfer of the world championship from the white establishment back to the white establishment. It was then locked up until, you know, Joe Louis kicked open the door and showed everyone what a real world champion was like at heavyweight. Joe Louis was going around fighting some dudes. And some of the colored champions fought great, busy schedules, you know, and there were the other champion, the establishment champions were winning good fights. It's not to minimize anything they were doing. It's just how busy people are, how many opportunities are for someone get the best of the champion. Khan says they show a different breed back then. A scheduled 45 rounder. For real though. Just a little 45 rounder. Or like with Jeanette and McVeigh in 1909 in their second of those 3 fights that year, a finish fight. And I feel like I read on Box Rec, one of these sites, that Langford participated in boxing's last finish fight. One of his fights in Mexico for the Mexican Heavyweight Championship was a finish fight. So Langford, his career brackets that eras quite incredibly, because he was in the Boston scene around the time when a young fighter died, and they banned decisions in boxing, and the clubs closed, and Langford started fighting more regionally. But that was the start of his career, and by the end of his career, he was capping off the finish fight era. And he wasn't rated, but by the end of his career, the ratings had begun. So that's what you get when you fight over 20 years in that era, like Langford at the level he fought. You know, the legendary level he fought for most of those years. You know, that's why he deserves to be remembered, along with a lot of his other great contemporaries. Lots of great fighters at this time. It's not to diss anybody. Lots of guys did great things. It's just that, and lots of the guys who are maybe not in the top 10 of this era still dwarf the resumes of the active boxers because of how busy everybody was. So to be hugely successful and supremely busy was incredibly difficult to do. Yeah, Khan, it is crazy. It's inspiring. But folks, I think I've been talking long enough. I'm going to get off. I've got some research to do before I go to bed. I've got to compile some records. So I want to thank everyone for coming by. Thanks to 86 Boxing. I hope everyone has a fantastic day or night. Take care now.